Welcome. My name is Charlotte Flindt Pedersen. I'm the director of the Danish Foreign Policy Society. But in 2008, I was head of the Department of Participation and Freedom Rights at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And in 2008, the Danish Institute for Human Rights and the Research School for International Development Studies hosted a conference called Digital Media in Repressive Regimes, Public Sphere, Civic Engagement and Political Mobilization. And the invited speakers were a series of international researchers from Howard University and Oxford University, as well as several prominent civil society activists and dissidents from China and Iran. At that time, the list of speakers represented some of the most visionary pioneers within the field of digital media and democracy. And the focus of the conference in 2008 was on the many liberating and democratic opportunities the new digital possibilities presented. Since then, the rapid digitalization has also revealed many democratic challenges, including technological and digital dilemmas, as well as many new asymmetrical power relations. This conference in 2008 took place after the Russian attack on Georgia in August 2008. And it also revealed some of the dissemination tactics of the Russian government. While Putin had declared that the biased media would be subject to control, he declared that the internet should be free. The Russian versions of Facebook, Kontakte, and Autocracies were used by the Russian government to spread counter-narratives among Russian users on the Georgian conduct in the war, showing how disinformation would be in the future. One of the organizers of this conference, Caroline Nellemann, was also the primary force of this conference in 2008. She came to me a year ago and suggested that we would do a follow-up. Unfortunately, she cannot be here due to a concussion. But so in many ways, she's the reason why we're here, because she, at that time, made the conference, and this time we made the conference. So we are recording everything, and hopefully she will be able to see it in a few weeks' time when she's freed of the concussion. But I think this conference shows what has happened like in these 2 decades, because now the digital media has been hailed. Like 2 decades ago, digital media was hailed as a pathway to freedom and democracy. We had the Arab Revolution following. But today, more governments are blocking and filtering the online content and are now actually using digital media and other online platforms to promote their political agenda, both at home and in the world. So without further ado, I'd like to pass on the word to our co-host today from Freedom House, Allie Funk, Research Director at the Freedom House. Welcome, Allie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for hosting me in Copenhagen. This is a lovely city, and I love any opportunity to come. My name is Allie Funk. I serve as Research Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. I'm honored to be here today, and I want to, thank the co-hosts who've put together this fantastic conference, the Danish Foreign Policy Society and International Media Support. For those who don't know us, Freedom House is a US-based organization founded in 1941 and dedicated to creating a world in which all people are free. We have offices in DC, New York, and several countries around the world. Our work, we identify emerging threats to democracy through research and analysis. We advocate for effective policies to those who have the power to make change. And then we work directly with and provide support to frontline activists and human rights defenders. So we're here today to explore whether the internet has fulfilled its promise as a liberating force. And I think many in the room can answer that question as a resounding no. But just as the internet, can be used as a force for democracy and to, push governments to be more responsive to their people, it's also a tool for repression. And it feels like lately we really are only seeing the latter part of that. Just last month, my team released the 2020 edition of Freedom on the Net, which is our annual assessment of internet freedom in 70 different countries. I'll be presenting these findings during the next session, but I want to touch on some of the highlights. It's the 12th consecutive year that we've produced this report, and it's the 12th consecutive year that we've seen a deterioration in internet freedom. Digital repression is deepening around the globe, it's growing more sophisticated, and it's becoming harder to counter. At home and around the world, governments are breaking apart the global internet, building digital walls designed to censor dissent and monitor users. The internet's role of connecting people to each other, creating spaces for sharing, learning, documenting, it can be inherently threatening to those in power. And that's why leaders everywhere are seeking to divvy up the open internet to create more easily controlled spaces, and they're actually succeeding. So a record number of governments, they're restricting what people can see and access and say online, whether that's blocking websites, hoarding data, or increasingly controlling technical infrastructure. And more than 3/4 of the world's internet users, they now live in countries where you can be arrested for simply saying something online. And this deterioration in internet freedom, it's alongside a larger global democratic decline. But I think, we talk about the bad news a lot. We should also take stock today of what's working and what's the good news. There's incredible and very impactful work being done to reverse these trends, including by everyone in this room. And our research has shown that these efforts are actually paying off and making a difference. Civil society, media groups, journalists, academia, worldwide are not only pushing back against digital repression, they're actually winning in a lot of cases. And democratic leaders, many of them have come together to create a positive vision for what the internet could be and what it should be, and have recentered human rights in their foreign policy. And the private sector are increasingly paying attention, grappling with how their products are undermining the rights of people around the world. So today, I hope we can dive into not only the problems, but some of the solutions. Because the future of the global internet rests on what we do today. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Gulnara Akhundova, the Regional Director for Eastern Europe and Global Programs at International Media Support in Copenhagen. Before jumping into my remarks, I would like to thank the Danish Foreign Policy Society, Charlotte, and Freedom House, Allie, for co-hosting this conference together with us, IMS, and the US Embassy in Copenhagen and Hermert Lanang Fund for their generous support. So, we are holding this conference in Copenhagen, and this is at the time when the war of aggression continues in Ukraine, and other conflicts emerge, escalate, and unfold in various parts of the world. At the time when digital iron curtains are being built and further strengthened, and high technology surveillance tools are used to silence the critical voices. At the time when news blackouts is a normal practice to control public debate, especially at the time of major political events. And perhaps the most terrifying part at the time when populations are often unable to distinguish good news, true information from false information, as a huge part of media ecosystem is intentionally filled up with disinformation and propaganda. Disinformation, propaganda, and to all intents and purposes, all other types of malign information operations is by far the most sophisticated tactic in the autocratic playbook. The tactic for autocrats to achieve their imperialistic ambitions, destroy peace, sow doubt, spread panic, and create distrust in democratic institutions, including the media. The social media is being used instrumentally to channel disinformation in coordinated ways, to undermine credibility of democratic institutions, and also undermine trust in the media. Disinformation, unfortunately, spreads faster and is better amplified than good journalism, let's admit it. And our media partners, IMS's media partners, have to find their audiences in the information noise and chaos created by disinformation and propaganda. I have now painted this very grim picture, and this actually makes all of us sad, but also alert, proactive, and solution-focused. The good news is, as Allie also said, is that this conference is also held at the time when independent civil society and media and activists are working jointly towards solutions to push back against digital repression and challenges. Let's also admit that the digital age has also been beneficial to journalism. For example, by facilitating data journalism and large-scale cross-border collaborations between investigative journalist organizations and initiatives, just in one example. Journalists can easier create connections and engagement with their audiences, and technology also provides for innovative business and editorial solutions. In Ukraine, a dedicated group of civil society and media and government actors have been engaged in a genuine, sustained dialogue with tech companies since the war of aggression started in February. And this is a dialogue around addressing the war disinformation and propaganda unleashed by the Kremlin. And this is done in cooperation with the Danish Ministry for Foreign Affairs Tech for Democracy initiative. And we, IMS, we are grateful for that collaboration. In Belarus, a courageous group of digital activists continues providing detailed account of digital rights violations to the UN and other international bodies. And also in Belarus, and actually elsewhere, in time when there is a high repression, courageous partners mobilize themselves online, acclaim their rights, and organize themselves via digital spaces. Digital spaces is the only platform for them to organize and mobilize. In Pakistan, the women-led Digital Rights Foundation supports the protection for women human rights defenders through a cyber harassment helpline and focuses on amplifying women's rights in digital spaces through policy advocacy and digital security awareness, raising in a time when women and gender minorities are disproportionately subject to certain forms of online violence. This is just a few examples, and I'm sure we can find much more examples in this very room. Those who have come here have been working towards solutions, as I know, individually and jointly. So let's continue this work, but do it jointly. We all agree more to be done, and I look so much forward to working with you all at this conference to explore solutions. And also, most importantly, I do hope that there will be a follow-up to this conference, that we do not see this conference as a one-off event. Thank you very much.
Yeah, now we have the first panel, and I'd like to invite the panelists up here to Allie, and yeah. Okay, sorry, I'd like to invite Allie up first, and then if Rikke could be ready, as well as Valentyna. So if you come up here, and yeah, and here you have for the cues and everything. So. So this first session will explore what is the situation of the freedom of internet and freedom of media and the digital age. So welcome, Allie, and I'll moderate later.
Wonderful. Yeah. Hello again, long time no see. Like I said, my name is Allie. I'm going to touch on our key findings in the latest Freedom on the Net report, and I hope what this presentation does is it sort of provides a basis and a high-level global landscape, so then in our subsequent discussions later today, we can dive into the nitty-gritty, but really serving as just a basis of what we're going to talk about. So like I mentioned earlier, Freedom on the Net is Freedom House's annual assessment of internet freedom. We cover 70 countries around the world. which is about 89% of the world's internet users. Unfortunately, we don't cover Denmark, hopefully in the future. So our methodology here, just to sort of explain what are we looking at, what do we mean by internet freedom? We define it as the same rights that people hold offline should also be protected online. We're not looking at any specific one government's behavior, but instead, what are the experiences of people in a particular territory? So what can drive internet freedom decline can be the behavior of tech companies, the behavior of governments, of occupying forces in a country. The methodology looks at three main areas. So one, first, how easily can they access the internet in a country? Are there digital divides? Is it expensive? Are there internet shutdowns? Are regulatory bodies free and fair? The second section here is looking at what does that internet look like once you're online in a country? So does the government block websites, force content removal? Does the government or other powerful actors manipulate content and then spread that online, undermining the diversity and reliability of the information landscape? And then that last section is how are the rights of people protected? Free expression laws, surveillance laws, privacy protections, whether people are arrested for their online speech, cyber attacks, harassment. And in each country we cover, we're lucky enough to partner with civil society groups who are on the front lines of resisting digital repression. Some really fantastic people, and we have a list of those folks on our website. So if you're interested in, who do you work with in Brazil, happy to have those conversations later. So you can see on the screen some of the top lines of, which countries had the biggest score improvements and which ones had the biggest declines. I think quite unsurprisingly, Russia had the biggest decline for a lot of the trends that we were talking about in the opening remarks. After the government's brazen invasion of Ukraine, they clamped down on dissent, blocked more social media platforms than ever before, and forced remaining independent journalists out of the country. Myanmar now has dropped to second worst, only scoring a slightly better than China. And I think it's really important because the coup was nearly 2 years ago there, and the military junta has now just consolidated its control over the internet. Unsurprisingly, I think China, still worst of the worst here. Iceland comes first in our rankings, followed by Estonia, and then Costa Rica comes in third. Excuse me? Yes, so the coverage period for this report was June 2021 to May 2022. So we will look at events that have happened since that end date, over the summer, but they weren't factored into the scores. Yeah. So conducting research on this scale for over a decade across 70 countries, it's really allowed us to see how have restrictions or protections for human rights online shifted over the years. So I think this lists some really alarming stats that thinks about what is the impact on people for internet freedom. So in 53 countries, this first stat, 76% of people worldwide live in countries where they could be arrested, investigated for simply expressing themselves online. That's about 53 of the countries that we cover. And then if you look over here, you see stats around different types of censorship that we track. So we actually had a record high this year of 40 of the 70 countries we cover. Governments blocked websites that carried political, social, religious speech. And then we also had, at least 22 of the governments we cover, they just blocked social media platforms altogether, or in at least 14, they shut off the internet. And it's often, this censorship, it's really ramping up around protests, elections, times of armed conflict, when authorities are really concerned about potential transitions of political power. So now I want to move into one of the biggest themes, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks, but it's about the rise of internet fragmentation, which can be a little of a wonky term, but all I mean by that is that more governments want to actually silo their own domestic internet so that they can more easily spread propaganda, they can suppress dissent, or they can collect more personal data from people in the country. So more governments, they're breaking apart the global internet to create more controllable online spaces. And this has serious consequences for human rights, and we lay some of these out on this graphic over here. But just to highlight a few, on a fragmented internet, people may not have access to the same messaging platforms that their family members or other like-minded communities do who live abroad. This means that it's a lot harder for them to communicate with each other. It's also more challenging to build global solidarity and seek accountability if people can't share documentation of human rights abuses to the international community. So a tangible example of that is in Ethiopia, where the government has restricted the internet in the Tigray region for over 2 years. This has meant that their human rights abuses there have not been able to reach audiences abroad. So this map shows all the different countries around the world that we identified at least one form of internet fragmentation. So if you notice, it's not just the most authoritarian and the most autocratic regimes like China and Russia and Iran that you would think of, but it's also countries that are backsliding democracies, even strong democracies, or ones that are sort of in between those two regime types. But the intentions of why governments are fragmenting the internet really differs based on the regime itself. So governments that are more authoritarian or have a worse track record for human rights, they're really trying to break apart the internet so that they can create an internet where disinformation dominates or critical commentary can be easily suppressed. But others, and the ones that are on the more democratic end of the spectrum, they're inadvertently breaking apart the global internet and trying to, counter cybercrime or address harassment or address disinformation. So really, serious problems that we need to figure out how to address, but they're doing so in a way that undermines the global internet and thus undermines everybody's human rights online. So regardless of the intention behind these policies, the outcome is similar. We're moving forward in an era in which, depending where you live, you have a totally different experience online. So here we break down 3 different forms of fragmentation that our research identified. First, 7 governments are seeking to control the domestic infrastructure. They want to centralize their ownership over technical infrastructure here so that they can physically isolate their populations from those abroad. This is really, really expensive to do, and it's really hard to pull off. So that's why you only have such a small number doing it, and it's only the most authoritarian and sophisticated governments like China, Iran, and Russia. Second, more governments are proposing or passing laws that limit where and how personal data can flow. And cross-border data flows, it's foundational to how the internet functions. It allows companies to provide services everywhere, regardless of where they're based. It allows internet speeds to be really fast as well. But a lot of these laws are really bearing these really problematic provisions in them. So, they're claiming to protect privacy, but what they're actually doing is forcing data to be stored on local servers where it can be more easily accessible by law enforcement or security agencies. So we have Rwanda up here as a really concerning example. A new data protection law forces companies to store user data locally. And in Rwanda, that's really alarming because there's been cases in which journalists or dissidents have been prosecuted because state officials have easy access to that data. And then that last section of fragmentation that we saw is actually the highest number in our research. So in over 2/3 of countries that we cover, governments have limited access to information that is based abroad. And we broke down the 5 different forms of censorship that this is happening. So if you take Cuba, for example, on this map, all 5 forms of censorship are highlighted. They've shut off the internet. They blocked foreign websites, often independent news outlets from diaspora communities. They blocked social media platforms such as, Signal, the encrypted messaging app. They've restricted circumvention technology like VPNs. And they also have new, really onerous regulation that forces foreign companies to remove speech. This really ramped up last summer when there were widespread protests against the government and trying to make political change. And in effect, that meant that people in Cuba couldn't speak to people in the diaspora community abroad who were really supportive of those protest movements. But here's where I mentioned something about democratic governments also doing this. And I want to take Australia as an example. So Australia lights up here on new laws restricting foreign websites and content. The country has a new Online Safety Act that was passed and implemented just in January. The law intends to address really serious harms, such as cyberbullying, that we want to address, and we should figure out how to address that. But it does so by expanding the government's censorship power. And it puts these really onerous regulations on small companies that have said, we don't know if we can comply with these, and we might actually have to pull out of Australia altogether. So in effect, Australians may have limited access to information, and it could splinter the web further. So part of this fragmentation, it's really about a larger competition to control the web that's happening globally. So the most authoritarian powers, such as China and Russia, they're trying to sell this model of digital control on the international stage. They're doing this at the United Nations. They're trying to convince, these swing states of internet freedom that we call them, like India and Brazil, that the model of digital control is better and more beneficial to them than the model of internet freedom. But democracies this year, a cohort of them, have really started to push back. And we see this, with the Summit for Democracy that US President Biden led to pull like-minded governments together, or the Copenhagen Pledge that the Danish government has put together to safeguard technology and democracy. Some really incredible work here that's put internet freedom in the center of foreign policy. But one of the things our research found was actually a lot of the democracies that are pushing forward in these efforts are actually not living up to those values at home. So of the 35 Freedom on the Net countries that participated in the Summit for Democracy, for example, 13 of them declined in internet freedom in their own territory. I like to end on positive notes. This is probably my favorite finding of the whole year because it was really unexpected. I'm talking about the global decline, but we also actually had a record number of countries that improved in internet freedom. It was 26 total. And in figuring out why was this the case, we dove into 3 main reasons. First, courts are increasingly safeguarding free expression and privacy. So they're ruling against certain governments and saying, no, that law is actually disproportionate or unconstitutional. Next, in at least 30 of our companies, tech companies, responded and protected user data or resisted government demands for censorship, or they took off disinformation that was led by governments from their platforms. And then in at least 26 countries, policymakers and regulatory bodies stepped up, protected human rights. We saw a lot of new laws that strengthened free expression provisions or reformed problematic surveillance laws. And the key point here is that civil society, and pretty much every example that we dug up, was at the core and the forefront of the effort. So they're often identifying a problem, then creating a roadmap on how to address it, and pulling in the people with the power and the economic resources to make change. So how do we bring more of that good stuff? So hopefully in our next conference, I can say internet freedom improved, and then reverse some of the digital repression. We have a ton of policy recommendations. I'm not going to go into all of them, and we can in the Q&A, or happy to chat. But just some top lines quickly. We are calling on democratic governments to institute laws and regulations that increase transparency about how companies operate and also strengthen privacy. We don't want this laissez-faire approach where governments don't do anything. Next, we want governments to coordinate more on global tech policy. We saw a lot of movement on that, and we want to see that continue. So, strengthening institutions like the Freedom Online Coalition. And then finally, robustly investing in civil society. They're the ones who are making change and really, really working with folks to better the internet. So I'll stop there, but looking forward to the conversation.
We just have time for a few questions before we go on to the next speaker. Now, we looked at you could say the government and the internet and how is it actually going, and the repression of freedom of speech on the internet. But you could say that isn't there a problem with the free speech on the internet? I think there is also even democratic governments. So what do we do about that? We've just had elections here in Denmark. They actually turned out pretty well, and the tone was good. But in other countries, you have a whole set of disinformation which takes place underlying, or maybe you have counter narratives. So how do you actually do this? Somehow we haven't found the way out.
Yeah. I think that's the million-dollar question. How do you balance free expression rights and trying to create an environment in which folks feel like they can come forward, debate, because debate is central to the democratic process. But how do we protect free expression while also creating safe online spaces where women, marginalized communities aren't constantly harassed and disinformation doesn't undermine that democratic process? I don't think there's any easy answer because there's trade-offs here. And it's going to be really dependent, on the sort of political context or cultural context. When we think about, what laws could governments pursue here, that's where we're really thinking about transparency requirements. Because I think a lot of the problem that we have now with how disinformation or harassment is spreading across platforms is we don't actually know always exactly how that's happening, because not all the companies are as transparent as we need them to be, or the companies themselves might not always understand how their algorithm's working. I always think of this example of Twitter. There was an employee that put out a public notice and was like, hey, we're looking for independent researchers to help us figure out why our algorithms are prioritizing really outlandish content. So that was somebody internally that didn't know. So that's where I am really interested in seeing how the Digital Services Act is implemented in the US, or in the EU. I wish there were parts in the US. Portraying my bias here. Because I think there's some really good proponents that are going to answer some of those questions about, one of the things I like the most is it forces companies, very large companies, to provide data to vetted independent researchers who can do that research and who really understand this stuff to try to figure out how it's working. And then I think that information will drive better policies. And the other thing I will touch on is I don't think we can solve this problem by just focusing on governments. The tech sector, civil society, this is really where you need a multi-stakeholder approach. And then the last thing I'll also note is these issues are not new to the digital age. We've had propaganda since the beginning of, time, you could say. So I don't actually always think that it's solvable. What we need to do is mitigate the impact and make sure we're doing it in a rights-respecting way.
Great, thank you. I think this actually, is a very good follow-up to allow. There's a question here, yeah?
It's great. Yes, I think I understand the question, but if I don't, follow up with me. So we aren't, if you were to look at all the countries, there are a lot of countries that we cover that are trying to tackle just that we didn't mark as internet fragmentation. So for example, the Digital Services Act, right now we don't view that as actually driving fragmentation. It really depends on how that framework will be implemented by the EU and member states. But I think there are ways that we can try to mitigate some of these harms that are not, maybe increasing government censorship power or creating an environment where it's really hard for smaller companies to even comply or operate. So in doing that, you're actually just cementing those big players like Google or Meta. So here, that's where I think about some of the transparency regulations and where that could go. And then also one of the really key points is when you are regulating around online content is making sure that there are strong democratic safeguards. So a lot of the laws that we've tracked, they don't include the judiciary as deciding, as a decider of what counts as protective of free expression or what doesn't. Instead, they just offload those decisions to private companies. And that's really hard for private companies to determine. If we as a society and our democratic leaders can't even get that balance, I don't know why we would expect a private company that might not know a cultural context to do that too. So making sure that we're putting those democratic safeguards in place in these laws will help mitigate the risk of fragmentation and also, I think, can help protect people from harassment or disinformation.
Thank you, Allie. So this is a perfect, next step to the next speaker, which is Rikke Frank Jørgensen. Okay. But let's give Allie a hand. Rikke Frank Jørgensen, who's senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and sits on a number of boards looking into the whole area of the technical tech platforms and how they are working. So this will actually be a focus on the company side of it. So welcome, Rikke. And We're looking into the question of how digital media actually became a problem. So welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Yes. Oh, it's shifting by itself. There we are. Thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk here. As Charlotte just mentioned, I will shift the perspective a little bit. I'm a researcher at the Danish Human Rights Institute, and I've worked on the intersection between human rights and technology for a number of years. So I'm interested in how the way we use technology and the way we regulate technology have an impact on our ability to enjoy human rights. So one perspective is, of course, a state perspective, but there is also a company perspective that I think is interesting, especially within the context of this conference. So that's where I will offer my remarks today, and then maybe we can follow up in the debate. So I did this. I came out with this publication a couple of years back in 2019. It's available open access. And what I did in this book was actually to gather people from various parts of academia and civil society to discuss some of the human rights issues that arise within the current age of datafication and tech platforms, and some of the human rights-based solution we could envision to those challenges. And I'll try in the following just to give you a few of some of the key findings of that work to structure my remarks. So what is sort of the point of departure, or where are we coming from in some of the issues and some of the challenges that we just heard Allie address in her talk? Some of the, you could say, matter-of-fact things that are going on in the current age. One of them is that we see an explosion in data points that can be gathered and collected about us from a variety of different sources, from our smartphones, from the computers we use, from wearables that we have on our body, from all kinds of different devices that we allow into our home, into our private sphere. And with that extreme datafication, both within the public and private sector, we have developed over the past 20 years an economy that's related to the use of those data points. We all know the way that big technology companies have risen, have gained power due to some of these developments, but it's also the case for the public sector as well. Datafication and the thirst for data is a theme that cross-cut both public and private companies. As part of this, we have what I call behind-the-back mining of human experience, sociability, political action, etc. And by that point, I mean to stress that this data collection basically takes place from a lot of the domains that we are in. It's not only our public or political or political civic engagement domain, but it's a number of spheres that we engage with as private citizens, as political citizens, as workers, as users of culture, etc. And that basically means that the infrastructures for public participation, where we exercise all our human rights, are entangled with data collection. It's basically difficult to interact in the number of domains and instances of society without giving away data. You really have to do an extra effort not to give away data. That's sort of the default. I sometimes use the picture that you drip data. I mean, just by being, communicating, interacting with others, you drip data, unless you make a very hard effort not to. So that's sort of a premise for our datafied society today. And if we then look at some of the platforms where a lot of that activity unfold. It means that the way that they are structured and designed, combined with this dripping data, have fostered new and amplified means of what we call disinformation, hate speech, online violence, harassment, some of the bad things. It has also fostered a lot of really, really cool things that civil society, activists, media people around the world use. I will not focus so much on all these positive aspects today. They are there as well, and they are well documented. But today I will talk about some of the more serious problems related to this datafication combined with the commercial platforms. It also means this intense data collection about us, that we have fostered new and more invasive means of targeting us as individuals. Because so much can be known about us, there's also a whole new array of business practices whereby we can be targeted as citizens, as political active individuals, as consumers, etc., by our state, but also by companies. So if we then look at the platform specifically and not so much on the state action, some of the problems that we are then addressing at this conference today, I would argue are rooted in the business models that drive many of these platforms, because it's largely business models whereby we give data by default in return for having free services. That's it's not the overarching business model. It's not the business model that all of them apply, all of the major companies, but it is still a dominant business model. Also, it's a business model because within this model, getting data and using data is the core value driver. Engagement-based design has been one of the primary design mechanisms. And by that I mean that many of the platforms are designed in ways to keep us on them. Our activities on the platforms, on the services that we use, carry specific value, and therefore it's important that we are there as much as possible and that we engage as much as possible. So take, for example, a lot of you have probably heard about the whistleblower from Meta, Frances Haugen, that came out and said that she was, one of the reasons that she came out was because she was disgusted by the way that the company increasingly knew of some of the negative impact of this engagement-based design models and refused to take action against it. These two elements mean that you have very, very strong market power, commercial power, and reach into our private and personal domains. And you have also created new means, as we will largely talk about today, for states to misuse platforms for their own advantage, as we've seen, for example, with the war in Ukraine and the invasion. So what are some of the human rights at stake by these models and by these logics? My main point in listing these rights is basically to argue that it's a number, if not all, human rights that are at stake. For many people, it's quite obvious that freedom of expression and freedom of information are at stake, because we have large corporate platforms that govern the types of conversations that are allowed, the way information is spread, the way data is collected, thereby implicating on the right to privacy. But it is rights beyond that. It is also right to life. How can it be right to life? Because a lot of the online violence and hate that's fostered can have real life implications, because human rights defenders are threatened in many national contexts. It's freedom from discrimination that is affected. Why is that? Because the way that many of these algorithms and content is curated have a disproportionate impact on especially vulnerable groups. We have tons of research documented some of the discriminatory bias that are implicated in these models. So, and there are many rights beyond that. And this is not, I mean, this is something that is largely recognized by now by the UN human rights system. So we've had, over the past 15 years, I think there are more than 40 different responses from the UN system, the UN human rights system itself, to some of these issues, where various thematic rapporteurs, the Special Rapporteur on Privacy, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, the Special Rapporteur on Online Women, online violence against women, etc., come out with various recommendations and report to warn about some of these human rights implications and to give recommendations to states and companies. We have actually on the website of the Danish Human Rights Institute an overview of all the technology and human rights related stuff that have come out from the UN over the past 15 years. But I've just pinpointed one out of many. That's from last summer, from the current Freedom of Expression rapporteur, Irene Khan, where she speaks to, I thought it was interesting because she actually, this is the first time I've seen the freedom to hold opinion addressed so explicitly in the context of manipulative information, nudging, war propaganda, etc. I'll just show you one excerpt from the report. So where she says, it's from last summer as far as I recall, that punishment, harassment, intimidation, stigmatization for holding an opinion, including coercive, voluntary, or non-consensual manipulation of the thinking process, are violations of the right to opinion. So whereas we've had many reports on freedom of expression more broadly and freedom of information, here she speaks actually concretely also, as you see in the last 4 lines, to techniques of recommender systems and micro-targeting, and how such techniques play a significant role in spreading disinformation and as involuntary or non-consensual manipulation of thinking processes contravene the right to freedom of expression. And these, I really, really like many of these UN reports because they are very concrete in illustrating which human rights are at stake here, why are they at stake, and what are some of the recommendations that can be given to state and companies. They always address both state and companies and how they can mitigate some of the impacts addressed. So then if we zoom out a little bit again from that concrete example, what are some of the responses to these challenges by companies and by the big tech platforms? Like I said, the UN is largely aware that there is a problem. They've done tons of reports, but there is still not what I would call a very affirmative or authoritative global UN human rights response to these challenges. We have, of course, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and we also have a new translation of these rights specifically into technology companies. We have, as I mentioned, a number of thematic reports, high-level panels, recommendations, the usual sort of UN style. But I think given the severity of these challenges and their sort of very techno-social complex, I think that we need something that's more than what we have here from the UN system. Then if we look at regional level, and I can take my own region that I know best, Europe, as you also mentioned, Allie, the EU Commission have really come forward with a huge regulatory package to address a number of these issues. I think we have right now 6 different regulatory proposals on the table. We have the Digital Service Act that's very concerned with illegal content online and the private companies' role in countering such illegal content. We have the Digital Market Act that's concerned with fair competition and smaller companies' entrance into the market. We have the AI Act, the Act on Artificial Intelligence. So all of these acts take a risk-based approach to the issues that I've just talked about. So for all these different regulatory approach. The DSA and DMA, they already adopted. The AI Act is expected to be adopted within the next 6 months or so, and then we also have data governance acts and others that are not adopted yet. But all of them are based on the idea that companies shall assess their own risk and mitigate that risk, and then, if not, there is some sort of oversight mechanism and potential fine attached. And if we look at the platforms themselves, they have been, like you also mentioned, Allie, some of the companies have been really good in pushing back on bad state behavior, but I would still argue that they are less strong in focusing on their own harms and really addressing their own harms up front. They are all of them best when it's easy to identify bad state behavior and then working with civil society and the more so-called democratic states in addressing those behaviors. And then my last slide. So some of the challenges that I think prevail is that we still have lack of what I would call solid human rights protection in many of the spaces where human rights are now exercised. There is also, I would say, a fundamental conflict between this data-driven business model that prevail in many of the big platforms and human rights. I think as long as we don't upfront address the data-driven business model and the engagement-based design, we will not solve a number of the current issues we have. Then the regulatory responses we've seen, even from the European Commission, still largely rely on company self-assessment. And you can then ask if you think that is enough in a domain where there's also so strong financial interests vested. And then I just finish with a quote from one of our previous but very strong special rapporteurs, David Kay, where he talks to the lack of clear and transparent rulemaking and enforcement, the weak and inconsistent consideration of context, and the extensive reliance on automation and lack of any meaningful appeals process as something that's still characterizing of many of the platform practices. And for example, in the new Act on Artificial Intelligence, there is still no remedy or appeals mechanisms for citizens to apply in cases where they claim abuse by an AI system. So I think I'll finish on that note.
Thank you so much, Rikke. Extremely interesting, and it seems as if it's like a very uphill battle because, you know, now we've been used to, as you say, giving away data all over, all the time, and it's the data is the value. It's actually what we give, what we pay for free services somehow. Is it at all possible to reverse this? Is it at all possible to think of another business model that would actually allow for also the faster development of technology as we have also seen?
I think actually I'm not as negative as I sound. I'm a bit negative when I talk about the sort of human rights response from the human rights system because it's such a huge machinery and the issues are so complex and it's private companies. But in terms of developing new business model, there is actually a lot of stuff going on. And there's a lot of smaller companies in many parts of the world that work on personal data stores and way of structuring citizen-facing services where citizens are in control of their own data to a much larger extent and where it's privacy by design, basically. So we have many of those examples. But I think a bit like with the environment discussion, it's a long process also of getting broad recognition of, that this is really not sustainable.
And do the companies actually recognize that it's a human rights problem? Because the thing is, the companies are not, their role is not to protect human rights as such. It's the government that has that role. So couldn't they just say, we actually it's not our problem. It's your problem.
All the big companies speak the human rights language as well and try to be part of that conversation. And they would all say that protection of human responsibility towards the human rights system is really important, and they are upscaling human rights departments and deploying human rights directors and conducting human rights impact assessment. So it's not that they are not doing anything, not at all, but I still think that these processes around, for example, company human rights impact assessment, we still need more transparency, and we still need more what I would call, human rights impact assessment that are more comprehensive than what is taking place at the moment.
When we look at the sort of the framework for this conference, it's about the digital, you could say, the race to the
race to the bottom.
Yeah, the race to the bottom between the digital or the authoritarian regimes and the civil society freedom of speech. And the question is then, okay, to me, what I really find terrifying here is the cognitive influence of people. The right to opinion, as you said, how can you uphold the right to opinion when you're constantly being targeted for all kinds of opinions? It's like, in the old day it was just propaganda or it was, marketing. But today it's getting so sophisticated.
Yes.
And you have like a company like Russia Today, but that actually has a specific role. And where does it leave people? Do they have then the how could you say, are they responsible if they're targeted in that way? Are they responsible for their actions? Are the girl who commits suicide due to what she sees on Facebook all the time and how she does things, or are they responsible, or are we just in the hands, you could say, of this media machine?
Well, if you look at the research, there are actually different schools, I would say. So some would definitely argue, like you do, that war propaganda, disinformation has always been part of the game, but now it has just been taken to a new level, and there are new, more invasive means of conducting it. But the skill itself is nothing new. We've had it always. So we have to understand the new arena where it's now being performed, and that it potentially harms people in new and more invasive ways. But there is also actually a line of research arguing that we actually overestimate the power of disinformation, the power of manipulation, the power of micro-targeting, that it actually has less power, and we shall also be careful not to buy into the narrative too much of it being so powerful, because that's also the narrative that the whole business model around micro-targeting is based on. So,
yeah, is there a question from the audience to this? Yes, just take the microphone there, and then
Yeah, hi. So
Hi.
I wanted to ask, do you think that the personal users, can we rely on personal users to be more responsible about which kind of data they share, or is it necessary to regulate through law in order to make these media that you're referring to into a more sustainable business model?
yeah. So I think we have to work on all channels, so to speak. We have to make users more aware that there are ways to protect themselves, and especially users, human rights defenders, etc., in very vulnerable situations. So we definitely need that kind of awareness, but it's not enough at all. We need to supplement it with regulation also, and more general, you could say, public debate, public awareness about these issues. So I would work on all dimensions at the same time. And taken to the extreme, we cannot as a society rely on users' self-protection. I mean, it's nice if people are more aware and they start using alternative services and encrypted tools, etc., but it can never be the only way.
Thank you so much. This leaves me, it's a perfect transfer to Valentyna Shapovalova. I'm always, who is a PhD fellow at the Department of Communication at the University of Copenhagen. And you will target, come with some concrete cases in terms of this. So, welcome.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte. And while I open my computer, I am Valentyna Shapovalova, and I'm doing a PhD project at the Media Studies section in the Department of Communication that deals with the Russian media and how propaganda and disinformation works through the state-aligned Russian media. And since the beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine in February, I focused my attention more and more on how specifically war-related narratives sieve through into the state-aligned media, in particular focusing on gender, traditional values, discourses of sexuality, but I will not talk about that today. Instead, I will give you a more broad overview of, because Russian media censorship and war propaganda, we could talk about just those things individually for hours. And I only have 15 minutes. So again, a quick overview, and then I guess Yevgeniy will also go into some related things, or related to the war at least, and Russia. Right. And I have this wonderful clicker. To start with a very concrete example of censorship and control of the media, control of journalism, control of narratives and information, something that happened on September 5th. Now, of course, a lot of things have happened in relation to these topics since February 24th, since Russia again engaged in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But I chose this date because two quite important things happened. Firstly, the former journalist Ivan Safronov was sentenced to 22 years in prison for high treason, supposedly, without clear evidence of what his fault actually was. And Safronov used to be an investigative journalist. He worked on cases related to Russia's weapon trade. He was arrested already in 2020, and his sentence, 22 years in prison, was seen by most of the Russia's independent journalists as a sign from the Kremlin that be careful on what you write, be careful not to overstep the boundaries and overstep the current laws. Now, the second picture, you see a face that is probably familiar to most of you, Dmitry Muratov, the chief editor-in-chief for Novaya Gazeta, one of the most important legacy medias in Russia, independent legacy medias. It was blocked in March this year, and on September 5th, their license to publish was revoked. So there was still a hope when they closed in March that they would reopen at some point, obviously when hopefully the war would stop and perhaps laws would change. But revoking their license was a very also clear statement from Kremlin saying that we do not allow you even to exist. But media control and censorship is nothing new in Russia. I mean, we talk a lot about the current full-scale war in Ukraine. We talk a lot about the current censorship, which is extreme. I mean, it is a level that we have not seen since Russia became independent. But since Putin came to power in the year of 2000, he very quickly realized the potentials of the media, the potentials of propaganda. So he slowly started gaining control of the bigger media outlets in Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that that the state started buying up large media outlets, but he did create a web of very nuanced and very nuanced control of the media. And again, I mean, I just took a few pinpoints. There are a lot more. But when Putin came to power again, there were large protests, or came to presidency again, there were large protests in the bigger cities in Russia. People were yearning for democracy. A lot of people were not satisfied with his re-election. And these protests, there was a huge crackdown on these protests, but at the same time, there was also an increased crackdown on the media and what the media could write about these protests. 2014, the annexation of Crimea and Russia's invasion of Donbass, the actual beginning of the war in Ukraine. We saw again different increased control with the media. The social media was used quite a lot in this regard to spread different narratives about Ukraine. Last year, huge protests to support Navalny. Also, a very big crackdown from the state, and again, an increased crackdown on the media, with a lot of the independent media outlets being stamped as foreign agents. And then we have February this year, and general the last 8.5 months. Again, as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine did not start in February. It started in 2014. We have seen in the Russian legacy media and pro-Kremlin social media channels spreads of anti-Ukraine disinformation and propaganda. But since February, this increased tremendously. So it is necessary, when we look at Russia's disinformation propaganda, it's necessary to conceptualize it within the framework of information war, since information is used as a tool in Russia's war against Ukraine. Now, a bit of a concrete example on how the anti-Ukraine narratives flourish on Russian. In Russian state-aligned media, television is a very, very important tool. I will explain in a bit why. This is a screenshot from also September, when there was when the mass graves in Izum in Ukraine were found. This is one of the most popular political debate shows in Russia, 60 Minutes, on one of the most widespread channels. Россия 1, and here the host talks about, firstly, I mean, there are two parallel stories. They have a war correspondent in Kherson, which is occupied by the Russians still, hopefully not for long, but now, war correspondent standing and talking about how Ukrainians are bombing residential buildings, which is one of the very recurring narratives that has been, again, around for more than 8 years, that it is Ukrainians themselves that are bombing their own civilians and their own residential areas. And the second story that is running parallel is a story of, again, the mass graves in Izum, which is portrayed as a fake. Now, this is a very common strategy within Russia's disinformation propaganda, mediated disinformation propaganda, to portray stories such as this one, stories that gain a lot of traction in the Western media, to take them, focus on them, and portray them as fake. This is not only done on traditional media such as television, but also on different social media channels. So here, fact-checking is used as a tool of disinformation propaganda, where things are really turned on their head. Now, television. Why is television so important? Television is, this is a graph from Levada under Levada, which, I mean, again, most of you probably know about it, an independent research agency in Russia. It has been stamped as a foreign agent as well, so we know they're good enough. So they do yearly trackings of where Russians most often get their news from, and television still tops. I mean, like the very quick ones of you in the audience probably see that added up, this gives more than 100%, and that's because people could choose more than one option. So, for instance, if you, Charlotte, you're sitting in Russia and you watch television and you also go online, then you would mark both of those. Yeah, so television still is on top. All of the broadcast television channels are state-aligned in Russia, meaning that you cannot turn on the television and see something that is critical of the Kremlin. Then we have social networks and internet media in second and third place. Up until February, it was, and I will also get back to that on my very last slide, you could, or at least some researchers have described the Russian media landscape as this discursive battlefield because of the independent media that was largely present on the internet and distributed their news and their narratives through social network and internet sites. But yeah, my point was also that it was described as a battlefield because, of course, as has already been mentioned, the internet is not a playground of only free speech and pro-democracy narratives. The state also, quite some time ago, realized that it is a great tool to spread their own narratives through. So just to say that those numbers do not mean that people were only accessing information that was critical to the Kremlin. This is in Russian. This is also from Levada, but they did not translate it to English. These numbers are all from this year, approximately the same time. So Levada went in and asked then, what sources of information do you trust the most when it comes to news about the special military operation, as it is still called in Russia, the war in Ukraine? And number one, we have the state-aligned TV channels as the first source that people trust the most. Second, we have the social media, and third, we have the state-aligned news agencies such as RIA and TASS, which is kind of like the Russian Reuters. Now, there is a distribution according to age. I mean, as you see there, this is not very surprising. The younger generations watch less television. So they trust television less in telling them what is going on in this special military operation. This is my last slide, and this is a bit messy, but bear with me. It's an illustration of very simplified illustration of flows of narratives and control in Russia. Again, overly simplified. There are a lot more news outlets and media outlets, social media platforms than that. But it is. I put it up to show how we still have the independent media outlets on this side, that although there are attempts to control them from the government side, I mean, all the censorship laws and restrictions also affect them, of course, but they still manage to produce content that challenges a lot of the narratives that we see on state-aligned media, or at least they did until the Kremlin blocked all of these sites at different points of time, most of them in March, after the law on what words you can and cannot use when you cover the special military operation in Ukraine, came into power, or into it was, how do you say? Thank you. So, for instance, you are not, as a journalist or as a person on social media, you're not allowed to use the word war if you are describing what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I have anecdotally seen hundreds of examples and people on especially debate programs who happily toss around the word war when describing what they presumably the West is doing in Ukraine against Russia. This is a very reoccurring narrative, but you're not allowed to use it talking about what Russia is doing. Also, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook have been blocked in Russia. So now, if you want to access a social media platform freely, you will go to. There's also YouTube, but it's not a social media platform. You will go to Vkontakte, which is like Russian Facebook, Одноклассники, or Telegram. Which is like a whole case in itself. I could talk about that for quite a long time. But I don't have time for that. Now, with these sites being blocked, people still do access them because some of the outlets still operate. They just operate from abroad because most of the independent or famous independent journalists in Russia have fled to countries such as Latvia, Georgia, Lithuania, the Czech Republic, and try to re-establish their editorial offices there. So people in Russia who still want to access the information that is critical of the Kremlin can still do so, but it is complicated because firstly, not all VPN services operate in Russia. Some of them have been blocked. And secondly, you actually need to know and understand how that works. I think with that I will end, and then waiting for your questions.
Okay, Thank you so much. So, Valentyna, one of the questions that I find very interesting is could you say what you actually describe as a sort of a gradual overtake of an information space by the Putin regime that has taken place ever since 2000, and in which the information space has become more and more important, not only actually you don't describe that, but not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine, in the near abroad, in Europe as such. So what does that tell us about the role of information, and are we engaged in an information war actually, and are journalists all of a sudden part of are they information warriors?
Well, I mean, that depends on how you define it, but the West is engaged in an information war with Russia. I mean, if you look at how Russia perceives it, then it's also definitely a yes. They have been talking about this again for quite some years. This narrative has increased, has been amplified since February this year. So yeah, if you didn't know, we are at war with Russia currently, as we're sitting here, according to Russia. Or the Kremlin, at least. So yes, I mean, I'm not sure how much I would put the label on every single journalist in the West as an information warrior, but I think it is important to acknowledge that that media, especially in autocratic states, is a tool in information warfare. That the stories that we see on Russian television, or that Russians see on television, I mean, they're not, firstly, they're not exclusively bound to television. I mean, in our digital age, these narratives are transmediated, so, you can see it on many different platforms. But also that these narratives travel beyond the borders of Russia, and again are used in the war that currently is going on in Ukraine.
one of the slides you showed was, which media do you trust actually? And I think that's an interesting thing, because if we are at war, you have to choose between which media to trust. Whereas you would say, like, I'm a media user in Denmark. Of course, I have some media that I prefer over others. And I also, of course, think about, do I trust this media or not? But not to the same degree. I don't have to take a stance all the time. So what does that actually do to the people? Like, what does it do to your mind? What is your cognitive,
I mean, there is, firstly, all of us do take a stance. I mean, the media that we prefer is most often also the media that we trust more. So there are, even in Denmark, where the media is, of course, a lot more free, we do take a stance on what media we trust more, what journalists we think deliver stories in a more unbiased way, or maybe even more biased way if this bias relates to our own. But what does it do to? I mean, there is a very clear division now in Russia on the information and narratives that are approved by the Kremlin and the ones that are not. And a lot is done to portray the narratives that are not approved by the Kremlin as disinformation propaganda. Again, going back to my example of stamping the story about the mass graves in Izium as a fake. So again, a lot is done to portray the information from the West. I mean, one thing is to block this information, right? But another one is to make people believe that this information is simply not true, that the worldview that is presented to you on television and other state-aligned channels is the truth.
Yeah. There is this famous book by Peter Pomerantsev on which is called Nothing's True and Everything is Possible. So what does it actually do to a media user that is, when you're constantly given counter-narratives, or the narratives are changing all the time?
Well, I mean, firstly, the Russian television viewers and people who already consume propaganda, and now I'm describing it in very black and white ways. Of course, it's not just two groups of people who consume propaganda and who don't, but who consume this propaganda, they are by now used to that narratives are, they change. I mean, one of the purposes of propaganda and disinformation is not, I mean, particularly propaganda, is not only to convince people that something, like one thing is true or one narrative is true. Sometimes it is also to distribute so many narratives that people get confused. What is truth anyways? Does it even exist? Who has it? Yes, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah.
So it creates a kind of a fatigue sort of stuff. You don't know actually, shall I believe this, shall I believe that, shall I...
In a way, sometimes. But again, that goes for some grand narratives or some grand propaganda stories. Because in other cases, the purpose is to convince people that this is the truth. And we have the truth, and this is the only truth that there is.
Because one of the pictures you was from 2011, when the demonstrations against, huge demonstrations against the transfer of power from Dmitry Medvedev to Vladimir Putin took place. And when you think about the apathy today in Russia, I think that's interesting. What has happened when you cannot. You could mobilize at that time, but you cannot mobilize today.
I mean, a lot of factors play into that also, because back then there was there were leaders in the opposition that could mobilize people in a better way than there are now. I mean, the Russian opposition. Okay, Navalny is in prison, right? So there are no clear leaders. There is very little like. I mean, people can always do something, but can do to actually to organize. Yes. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Okay. There's a question in the very back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jane Clementiva. I work at the Danish Culture Institute, a project manager of a New Democracy Fund. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I would like to reflect a little bit on the title of this session about how digital media became a problem. And to be honest, I do have a big concern with the narrative that, you know, we have a regime that has repressed a lot of people and closed all the media, and this is why we are where we are, for two reasons. The first one is because it actually makes the whole population very kind of an object for somebody's manipulation. We don't really see people in this discourse. We don't really understand that they are actually also an active participant in this process. That's for one. And I honestly believe that it makes us a little bit blind to really understanding the reason for why propaganda is so effective, how digital media really work and how they can become a problem. So I really miss a little bit of a nuance in saying, yes, Putin did all this terrible stuff, but people in Russia let him do it, people in the West let him do it, and they all are an active agents in some way. So I'm not sure. It's not actually a question. It's just a remark that I think we really need to somehow move away from just looking at what Putin has done with the laws. It's absolutely important, and we should bear it in mind. But maybe make the conversation a little bit more nuanced and complex by really trying to understand why all this tragedy happened. Because it doesn't only happen because Putin made it happen. It also happened because of some historical reasons, sociological, psychological, all kinds of stuff. And I really think we should discuss that to be better equipped to combat that in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And thank you so much for the comment. Like I said, I only had 15 minutes, so I could not go into the details and not give you a proper historical overview or talk about how it actually affects people and how propaganda actually works, all the narratives on Ukraine and so on and so forth. So thank you for adding that. I completely agree with you. I mean, the whole theory on, like, the needle theory of communication that talks about how people are just injected with information and that we just believe it is like 100 years old. It's very outdated. I mean, since then we've had a lot more and better theories on how communication actually, how communication processes actually work and how people respond to that and how people. How do you say? Not eat it, but yeah, you get what I mean. Consume it. So 100%. I mean, the thing with people and also giving the agency back to the people. Here, I mean, these narratives are quite. And again, I'm going to give you quite a simple answer because we don't have an hour. But these narratives are quite appealing. So it is a lot more appealing for you as someone who is sitting in Russia to sit and read about how all the good things Russia is doing in Ukraine and how actually Russia was forced to invade Ukraine, how it was inevitable, how Russia was threatened by the West and all of that. Than sitting and reading about all the terrible things that Russia is doing. So one thing is that it's a better story, and some people like better stories. It's easier to live with. That's one thing. Another thing that I did not talk about, but it's a huge factor that plays into propaganda, is poverty. A very good way of keeping people in certain beliefs is keeping them very, very poor. So they simply cannot afford or do not have the time to seek out some other narratives or mobilize or understand different nuances. So there's a ton of different factors that play into this, cultural, political, historical, and yes, I agree.
Thank you. We will just continue the discussion over here. So I'd like to ask Allie and Rikke to come up here and just sit, and then we'll take the question from the audience. So, and Valentyna, if you will sit over here. Yeah. So we'll just have a question, and if you could wait for the microphone.
Yes. Yes. So thank you very much for all the presentations. I had a question for you. Actually, it's very reasonable with all the narratives, right? And the reason people would buy it, but it's also because I'm doing a research and I'm interested, like how the youth in Russia perceive all the events, because it's one thing to buy or not buy a certain narrative, but another thing when social media is a huge part of your life just because you're youth, right? And then all the media, as you showed, is blocked now, at least those like Facebook and Instagram, which were very often used by those. So isn't it a kind of indicator, or does, as it was said, Russian government perceive the use or such activities as toward those who are, like, you know, dark-minded and don't have any position, or if there is a tendency of opposition among the youth, because like blocking those social media platforms that you use daily is something, you know, that should cause you some thoughts. Do they don't have? Is it a situation when they don't have any opportunities to react, or is it because that's not important? Like, how would you explain that? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, great question. There is, again, a lot of nuance in this, because, I mean, I mentioned poverty. One other thing that plays in is also geographically what we see from different surveys, or what we know from previously, that people in Moscow and St. Petersburg are more prone to be more critical towards the government, at least on average. That doesn't mean that everyone living there is critical, but this is the case. What we know, and what you also saw, I mean, this was like a very broad graph. There is also, if you go in and find Levada and find this report, there is a distribution according to age, who consumes what information. So younger people do consume more news on social media, and like what I said and what you said. What do they do then when the social media is blocked? Well, what we think they do is install VPNs, and if the VPN they're using gets blocked, they install a different VPN. That's just how simple it is. I'm following different younger activists on, particularly on Instagram, just on my own private interest from Russia. The vast majority of them are still there. They still post things, meaning that they installed a VPN or found some other way to jump over. The ones that I'm following, because they're not focused on the war, being critical of the government, they don't post anything about the war. So that's also another thing, that you circumvent this, or like you find a way to exist on these social media platforms by simply not mentioning certain words, or not being critical of the government. But it is, I mean, what we see when we talk about resistance is that it is more driven by people in the younger part of the population more than the older part. Yeah. Did that answer your question a bit? Yeah.
Yeah, a question here from Jane.
Thank you. This is a question for Rikke in relation to the data-driven business models based on engagement design and algorithms. I think there's a problem with this, and I think there's a problem with how we talk about it and how we don't talk about it. Having worked with ICTs for many years, and even in early days, before internet and coming onto the internet, and how are we talking about this? How does stuff work? So I would like to go back to how does stuff work? How do they actually work? I think the film, The Social Dilemma, showed some of how these platforms work. Not everyone has seen that film. People even mistrusted aspects of it. But if people really knew how the platforms work, what we say yes to when we accept conditions, how they can harvest bank information, photos, etc., via our mobile phones. Today, mobile phones, they hold our lives, families, finance, movement, etc. Now I'm getting to the question. What do you think we can do to get better at explaining people, citizens, about how stuff works and how it infringes on their rights? Thanks.
Good question. I've talked a lot also with younger people on these issues, and my impression is that a lot of them understand what's going on. I mean, it's not like they don't understand it at all, but that there are some counter logics. So one is that they understand it more or less, not in detail, but they understand it, but they don't think that it's so important or so political that their data is being harvested. I mean, that's very much the case with a lot of the people I talk to in the Nordic countries, that they are simply not, I would say, politicized. They don't see the political dimension of the problem. They have too much of a, I would say, consumer angle to it. That's sort of the business model, and they more or less accept that. But then I think we've also been way too lazy in Europe, for example, in developing and showing alternatives. Because, I mean, we have a lot of tech startups and companies that are slowly getting into the realm of developing alternatives and showing different models. And I think we can do much more there, and we should have done much more earlier, but better now than never. But I don't necessarily think it's a problem of not understanding what's at stake. Another dimension that I heard a lot earlier, maybe not so much anymore, is the answer that, well, this is part of our social infrastructure, and we don't really see how we can attend the football club or, be active in the community around our school, or because it was so integrated into so many of our public services, after-school activities, etc. I think there more and more organizations are taking a stance, and it's not quite as integrated as it has been, but that's also a part of the answer.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for your wonderful presentations. I have a question regarding the importance of digital education and literacy efforts that I think kind of speaks to something that you've all three kind of gone through. I think you, Rikke, talked about the freedom to hold opinions. How do we ensure that people can still do that in an environment where we know that regulation can do some things and hopefully help some of the dilemmas? But I think, as you also said, Allie, they will probably never be perfect, the regulative measures that we have available. So how can we mitigate harms? And I just wanted to hear, it's a question or comment for all of you really, to just share your reflections on how do we strengthen the educational efforts that we have at hand. I think even in Denmark, where we are quite aware of some of the issues, there's still some way to go. I hear you saying that right now, Rikke, as well. Thank you.
Maybe if you start, Allie?
Sure, I'm just jotting down notes because that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think we all, at least us two and maybe you two, we all touched on the role of regulation, smart regulation, making sure that it's crafted in a way that isn't going to sort of serve as a model for more authoritarian purposes around the world. I think that's something our research shows about how what like sort of democracies do gets picked up and piloted in other countries. And then you'll have like Singapore, for example, the government rolled out a new really problematic fake news law that they said, well, this is just what Germany did with an SDG law, so if Germany can do it, why can't we do it? And there's obviously a lot of very clear differences between the context in which those two laws are being implemented. So I do think there's a role of regulation. And you kind of touched on digital literacy and civic education, and building those, building digital literacy within curriculums from the beginning, but also, not just for younger generations, but folks regardless of age, and building that in. And then one thing that popped in mind when you were speaking about how do we get more creative in thinking about solutions, there's this fantastic thinker named Ethan Zuckerman, who has been doing a lot of really creative work about alternative models for social media. And he has a really, really good lecture about creating different types of platforms. And what if you just had a lot more diversity in platforms, so then you wouldn't have a few number of them that have such big control. And he talks about two specifically. One is called Switter, which is Twitter. I love it. It's Twitter for sex workers. So they can go and communicate and talk and have a safe space. And then there's another one that is particularly for the LGBTQ community in the Middle East and North Africa, where you can, maybe you're talking about how to join forces in activism or political change, but maybe you're just, sharing stories and wanting, if you're a younger member of the population, you identify within that community, you just want to go somewhere where you feel supported. So just getting really creative on some of these models, and a lot of work has really been done in the academia sector to think about that.
Yeah, I also think it's a really great question, and digital literacy is it's a buzzword now, and it's important, of course, to include in curricula and school, etc. But I think we need to think about it much broader, actually. That it's any civic organization, any sort of political entity, or sports association. Everyone has to understand that the tech dimension is part of how we live, how we communicate, how we work, how we interact with one another. And we should all take it in as a topic that we are, entitled to engage with and have an opinion about. I think there's a lot of, I often meet people who push it a bit aside because they feel that they don't know enough about tech, as if you need to know a lot about tech to have opinions about these issues, and I think that's really that's a pity, because it's something that's so important and that is so embedded in all of our society by now that we all need to think about it and to talk about it. From the football club to the whatever organization that penetrates our society. So I think it really needs to come true in that way, and not only as like a specific new course in the curricula. And then I think there's also a more, you could say, hardcore rights education that's related directly to a lot of the new regulation. For example, in relation to GDPR, you have a lot of data rights, and you need to know those rights actually to be able to claim them. So in relation to some of these new regulatory packages, there's a very concrete element of getting people to know that they have rights. They have right of data access, data portability, data control, etc., and how to claim those rights in the various national contexts that they live in.
I think we'll just take a final question before the coffee break, or then two more questions before the...
Hello? I was just wondering, it's a question for you, Allie, and maybe for you, Rikke, that considering regulation and transparency, do you have any thoughts on how we should approach the regulation of the physical digital infrastructure? Here I'm thinking about the undersea cables, the towers that we use to access the 4G network, in which we can see that more and more of this digital infrastructure is laying on fewer and fewer hands. Right now under the Atlantic Ocean, we are building a new big undersea cable that's mostly owned by Meta and Google and all the regular suspects. So do you have any thoughts on how do we approach regulating this? aspect of the internet?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great question. I mean, you're picking up on this trend of centralization across the internet stack, and that means like everything from the technical, the companies that actually provide the technical infrastructure to the platforms, and there's different layers there, and it's been moving toward where the folks up here are increasingly owning the things down here. So Google and Meta trying to get into that game. It's I think it goes back to some of the really important principles that are part of within democracy. It's about diversity of ownership. You don't want the same company to own all three of those, because the more companies you have, the more options people have, and you can choose sort of what works for you. So if you want to use a service provider that has maybe fewer, it's more affordable, but you have less data. Maybe that works for you because you don't need certain things. So creating more options for folks and more diversity in that, I think, is really helpful. And particularly when you're thinking about, I think, how this plays out in certain European countries or US might be really different than how it plays out in another country where the government is more interested in controlling those entities, because if you only have one or two companies that maybe own the internet backbone or own service providers, it's easier for the government to then censor or surveil, because they have less, they have fewer places to go to make that order for censorship or make that order for surveillance. So that's where I really think about diversity. It's not just about empowering us to make choices that are best for us, but it's also a human rights problem that we have diversity across infrastructure providers.
I think just because we're actually running over time, I'll just let Henrik just have the final question, and then we'll,
I have now heard a lot of words where the line between it is that freedom is very good and we shouldn't control the internet. But in a short while ago, we had the COVID-19 coming up here in Denmark and in the rest of the world, and a lot of people then announced on the internet that this was it was a fake. It was driven by Big Pharma, and it was made for controlling the people and so on, and based their voices on that they knew 3 people and they had it, and it was only like a normal flu and was over in a week or something. So in that case, they try to minimize the people who take the medicine against it, and the experts on the TV tell us about spike proteins and so on, and who understands that? I don't. So there, could we see is it always and good with the freedom, and if it isn't always good, how we then how could we divide the good for the bad?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I actually thank you for. Can I start?
Yeah, you
Sorry,
can.
I'm
Then
just
you
jumping
will
in.
answer the question.
No, it's just because I wanted to add to the whole media literacy question that when we talk about media literacy, I think it's very important to also talk about press freedom and how we understand ytringsfrihed. I mean, how do we understand the freedom of voice and speech and all of that? Because it's not as easy as that, as that we just make all of the information free and all of the opinions free, because then we do risk ending up in situations as we saw with COVID-19, and we have also seen some cases. I mean, I know mostly stuff about Ukraine and Russia, but cases in Ukraine where actually limiting information from Russia has been helpful. I mean, it has been seen as a necessity from the government side after 2014. So I think there is a necessity to nuance and to start discussing what do we actually mean by freedom of speech when we talk about digital media and we talk about in general media and information in 2022. Yeah, that didn't
Okay.
answer your question, but I just wanted to say
I
thank you for
guess
raising it.
This is something that will come up in the discussions during the day. So now there's a 15 minutes coffee break, and we'll see each other, and then return for the next panel. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists.
It's great to see so many of you also for this session. And before introducing the panel, just to say that what we are trying to dive into now is really the digital media tactics of autocracies. We've just been discussing a little bit whether it's autocracies or it's more authoritarian regimes, and I think it's probably more the latter. But this is where we'll be focusing on during this panel. My name is Eva Grampi, and I'm an independent consultant working on human rights and sustainability. And also, I have a past at the Danish Institute, so we will also, of course, continuously connect to the human rights aspects of this discussion. As I said, we will try and dive into the digital media tactics. And I suppose one could say that in the good old analog days, when you made a coup, what you did was really going for the TV station and the radio, then that was done when you tried to control the media. Today, of course, things are much more complex, as you also heard from the first panel. Some have been describing this as the 3F strategy or tactics that the authoritarian regimes are using. The 3F being, you could say, fear as the first F, targeting individuals, intercepting their communication. The second F is really friction, doing selective censorship. The Great Firewall you perhaps heard about in China. We also heard in the previous panel about the fragmentation of the internet. And the third F is flooding. It's really to have pro-government postings in the social media platforms, etc., trying to divert the discussions or trying to undermine discussions, as we also heard examples, just calling things fake news up front. So the 3F approach, one could say, is a kind of a way of having your media tactics if you are an authoritarian government trying to control the digital media. But we will be much wiser getting into this now, listening from the panel. And what we will do here is giving each panelist, again, some time to present. Not as long time, you have 12 minutes, and I will be strict. But you will dive in from different perspectives. And the first one I will give the floor is to you, Chris Walker. Chris Walker is a Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, which is a non-profit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. You oversee the department of NED's analytical work, and also Chris has, before joining NED, he was actually the Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House. So you have a really broad entry here. And I think you will be really amazed of Chris's insights. He is on the forefront on the discussions on how authoritarians are influencing the democratic systems. So Chris, over to you.
So thank you so much, Eva, and I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here. In particular, Carolyn Nelleman, who's not here today, but really want to express my appreciation to her. I think I'd start by making just a couple of observations on the assumptions we had, say, a decade and a half ago, which is essentially the time that Freedom House, through its great work, identified the start of the democratic recession. And the democratic recession is really both democratic decline, but also authoritarian resurgence. It's the combination of the two. And if we think about the information domain, the technological domains, there really were assumptions, as has already been discussed in some of the terrific questions in the earlier session, about what we imagined the information domain would look like. And essentially, we thought it would be more free and more vibrant, and it would be easier to communicate. And in many ways, that's been true. There have been terrific advances that have given voice to people, certainly in closed settings, that's very, very difficult to have when you have media hegemony or dominance in the way that has been described, say, in today's Russia, where state media dominates, even though we're in an era of globalized information. It's also true in the People's Republic of China, and I can talk a little bit about that. But I think paradoxically, what we've discovered today, even though we imagined that the media environment would be freer, that the media might even have more integrity because there would be competition, we'd all be sharing with each other relentlessly, which is true. What we found today is, as much as having freedom and integrity, we actually have a good deal of control and often what is at least perceived to be chaos in the information domain, certainly in the social media domain. And that creates some real challenges today. Ron Diebert, who's the director of the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, has said that the social media domain has 3 painful truths. And he wrote about this, I think it was the January 2019 issue of the Journal of Democracy. And he made the point that was made earlier during the discussions today, that the surveillance-based central features of social media create real problems for open communication, and that users of these technologies do it willingly, if not always wittingly, which is to say that we give our rights away in order to have access to these things, and that in the end, this enables authoritarianism. It's actually an enabling vector for authoritarianism. It would have sounded ridiculous to make those arguments 15 years ago. And I'll make one other point on this using Freedom House data. The democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence, which started around 2005, curiously, or maybe not so curiously, tracks the explosion of social media. So Facebook, Twitter, Google was a little bit earlier, but Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube came on the scene right around the time of the emergence of the democratic recession and the authoritarian resurgence, and I think we need to reflect on that. Very difficult to demonstrate causality, but it is something that I think we all need to think seriously about as we think about ways to improve this. Make a final point on this side of things. I think it's really important, especially when we're speaking in a wonderful country like Denmark, to separate the countries that have more accountable, transparent institutions from those that are closed and don't have institutions that can fulfill those functions. So Denmark is a very high performer on the Freedom House Index, and rightly so. Accountable, transparent institutions, high trust in society, and is able to execute elections in the way you've just done in the last days. That's become much more challenging in most other places in the last 15 years, and I can say that speaking from the perspective of an American. I think this has changed dramatically in ways we didn't anticipate, and we need to reflect on why that's been so. In transparent, institutionally accountable settings, you can have vigorous debates about how you should manage data, how you should handle surveillance, how you should navigate all of these incredibly complex issues connected to the digital revolution, for which there are no simple answers. You need to have judges and staff in the courts who understand how technology works in order to make well-informed decisions. That's a tall order. And I suspect it's a very small subset of countries around the world that check all of those boxes to be in a position to handle these things. Mm-hmm. Say this as a pathway to talking about the countries that aren't so fortunate to have the sort of institutional accountability and transparency that countries in Northern Europe have, and then a small subset of others around the world have, if you look at Freedom House findings. That is, deeply consolidated, institutionally accountable democracies. It's a very small subset of the overall number today. As you move across the spectrum into countries that are less free and more closed, it becomes a very different conversation. So maybe I'll swing the conversation all the way over to a country like China, which is the worst performer on the terrific Freedom on the Net initiative and project, which was started over a decade ago. And I just make one other observation about our assumptions on this. One of the assumptions we had when I was at Freedom House, when Freedom on the Net was created and designed, was that access to the internet meant that there would be more freedom. And I think if you look at the People's Republic of China, where there's an amazing degree of access, people can use the internet, they do in great numbers, but there's very little freedom. If you look at the Gulf countries, where you have internet penetration 80%, 85%, 90%, very little freedom. We have to reflect on whether those assumptions tell us something about the way the internet has evolved, and whether it should be the case ipso facto, if there's more access, you have more freedom. I think, the question is almost answering itself. But it's one of these assumptions that's been challenged, and I think we all need to reflect on it. But if we talk a little bit about what's happened in the era of globalized information, the digital revolution, in countries that we imagined with more access would become freer because there'd be more pluralism in the media space, I think we miscalculated on that front. So if you look at a country like Russia, which was described so ably in the previous session, there was, at the end of the Cold War, an enormous flourishing of diversity in the media space, but not so much pluralism. And under the regime that's been in place now, going into its third decade, there's profoundly little pluralism, relatively speaking, although I would say there's probably still diversity in the media space. It's true in the People's Republic of China as well. The landscape today in 2022 looks nothing like the landscape in the PRC from 1982. Far from it. It's dynamic, it's modern, but it's not really pluralistic. And this is true even in an age of hyper-connected usage of the internet. What's happened, and I'll use these two examples, although I think there are other countries that would be relevant to this discussion beyond China and Russia, perhaps some of the Gulf states, but I don't think there are too many countries that have the global reach that China and Russia have. Interestingly, as they've refined, as the authorities in those countries have refined their ability to manage the digital space, and I'll speak about China a little bit, they've also turned outward. And so in a globalized environment, it's not sufficient to say that the technological treatment, say in East Turkestan, of the Uyghur people, where there's now just a phenomenally developed surveillance state that operates there. It's true in Tibet as well, maybe a little less so than in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. But what's happening now is that these techniques and methodologies are actually being applied across the entire PRC. And as China and its state-owned companies and its nominally private companies that operate in conjunction with the state push outward into the global south, everywhere actually, the backbone of the tech platforms that are formed in the PRC then start to share their norms in other parts of the world. And it's a very profound challenge because the countries that are interested in this technology want to modernize. They see the adoption of these technologies as a path to modernization. But as someone hinted at in the earlier discussion, it's very hard to separate the advantageous aspects of these technologies from the disadvantageous aspects. And part of the disadvantageous aspects, just to finish the point, and maybe I'll conclude with this, is that often the marketing or the narratives around these technologies are oriented towards arguments along the lines of safety and security, which we're all interested in. But what we discover is, in the absence of the institutionally accountable and transparent institutions that Denmark and the Scandinavian countries have, the absence of those institutions, the adoption of these technologies tends to be done without meaningful public debate, without meaningful scrutiny. And so in a report that we released this summer that was authored by Stephen Feldstein of the Carnegie Endowment, he examined the way in which middle-performing states were adopting surveillance technology, AI surveillance tech. And the principal point in his findings was that these technologies are being adopted just about everywhere, from the Western Balkans, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, but far too often the expertise doesn't exist on the ground, either in civil society or in government, to properly scrutinize these technologies before they're adopted. When China is involved in these technologies or their state companies, they're often purposefully avoiding scrutiny of this by trying to focus on the executive branch or narrow players in the executive branch of governments in which they're engaging, to the exclusion of parliaments, to the exclusion of civil society, to the exclusion of independent media, to the extent it exists in the country in question. And it's only after the fact when society says, wow, where did these 500 Huawei cameras come from, and what exactly are they doing? Where is the data going? Do we know where the data is going? Who made the decision on this? And so what I would stress is that part of our challenge in the future is that like-minded countries have to find ways to work better together, to share information, to support each other. And I would say especially the countries that have the good fortune to already be stronger democracies, to help those that are in a relatively weaker position to make sure that they can make informed decisions at the outset and not find themselves more vulnerable after adopting these technologies, which absolutely is a pattern that has emerged. And I'd be glad to talk more about that in the Q&A, but maybe I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. Also to pointing to a number of issues and also broadening a little bit the discussion to a global perspective, not least bringing China into this. Could I just ask you, when you said in the beginning that the social media domain, where you kind of give data away, also knowingly, you hinted to the point that the way that those domains are designed are kind of supporting, underpinning, and authorizing kind of design or preference, that you actually, by design of those platforms, undermine democracy. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about that? Because what was also said in the previous panel, people are willingly giving away data, also especially young people, and I think it was Rikke saying that they also know that the data is being used, but it's a price they're willing to pay. They pay with their data and pay perhaps with their freedom to actually use the platforms. Are we, as people trying to promote democracy and human rights, perhaps talking in the wrong language here? You're talking about the system, yeah. But are you actually not addressing the individual cost-benefit analysis that we all do when we use platforms? So how do we do the right thing? Are we doing the right talk here to actually try to counter this tendency?
It's a great question, and I think in open societies, it's a real question as to the degree to which people have the freedom to make those choices. Because in practical terms, if you elect not to participate in one of the dominant platforms that are operated, say, from the west coast of the US, you're really being shut out of all your family, friends, and basically your universe, because the virtual world has become so critical to day-to-day life. And so it's a very hard decision. That's one thing. I'll relate also to Ron Diebert, to something he observed at some point that really is stuck in my head, which is, he said, you need 3 or 4 advanced degrees to be able to properly assess the terms of service when you're deciding to adopt a technology or to sign up for an app. You need a business degree, a tech degree, and a law degree. I mean, how many people here actually read through all the terms of service before they sign up? I suspect it's a very small number, if any. And so, in essence, you're being pulled in on the one hand, but I also don't think it's that simple. And maybe just one last point on this. I think you mentioned the 3 Fs at the outset, was it? I would add a C to that, which is, there's a huge convenience factor for people to adopt these technologies. And it's very seductive, and it's very attractive, and it's very hard to resist at the outset. And then when you factor in algorithmic inducements, once you're in the technologies, it's even harder. Anybody who has teenage children watches how they use technology, let alone even older adults. We're all susceptible to it. It's human nature. We released a report, and this is relevant to a question from the earlier session, called Demand for Deceit, which really looked at the psychological drivers of why people are attracted to disinformation. But I'd make one last point for the authoritarian context, which is in China today, which has the most sophisticated set of tools that have been developed for this. So for example, WeChat is used by millions and millions of people, both within the PRC, but millions outside of the PRC as well. And it's become an all-purpose tool, like Alibaba, for every imaginable sort of service. And I'm not convinced that this is a coercive tool. There are elements of coercion that are part of that after people are using it, which is to say, if the authorities feel you're going astray of what they feel is appropriate in terms of your behavior, you'll suddenly find you can't purchase air tickets to travel, or you suddenly find that you don't have the right to travel outside of the province you're in. That's all being done by technological surveillance, tracking, monitoring, and then data processing. But it's not at the outset all about coercion. It's actually about embedding people in the technology through convenience as a pathway to control and then ultimately coercion.
Thank you very much. And just to let you know, I will open up and make sure that I have ample time for questions at the end. But I think we would like to go through all the panelists in this. So thank you very much, Chris, for really thought-provoking presentation already. Then we'll go to the next speaker, Yevgeniy. And you will actually have a PowerPoint. But before standing up, just a brief introduction also of Yevgeniy Golovchenko, who is a Post.Doc at the Department of Political Science and University of Copenhagen, and also an affiliate of Copenhagen's Center for Social Data Science. And I think through your presentation, we will really get into understanding how you actually use data to try and unfold some of that, those understandings that Chris is also pointing to, how one gets embedded also using, for example, YouTube, and what does the band mean. So Yevgeniy, the floor is yours.
So I'll get a clicker and I'll bore you with a PowerPoint. Apologies in advance. So, whoops. All right, so first of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the most important topics right now. That is information control and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'll be focusing on YouTube because YouTube happens to be one of the top 3 social media platforms in the world, in Russia, in Ukraine. So I'll be showcasing some empirical research that my co-authors and I have been doing. And but first, I'd like to give you, so my plan is to first give you some background about information control during this war. Then I'm gonna showcase some findings. I'm gonna stand here so I can see better, great. And at the end, I'll try to give you some broad takeaways, like what's the broad takeaway from these findings. Okay, background. So as the Russian tanks were crossing the border into Ukraine again in 2022, Valentyna covered this very well. Just like in 2014, the invasion was again legitimized with a series of disinformation narratives about the war on Russian television. Just to give you some examples of the disinformation narratives in the first weeks, we were told that Russia is not attacking any cities, that no civilians are being targeted, and that everything is fine. It's A-OK, Russia's winning, it's all good. The interesting thing here is, wait a second, I'll get some water. A bit of a flood, but yes. So the interesting thing here is not just the disinformation narratives themselves, but what followed. Because in March, as I think Valentyna covered before, Putin signed a law that gives Russian citizens up to 15 years in prison for openly doubting or questioning the central narratives. In fact, I think they call it the anti-disinformation law. Please correct me if I'm wrong. In fact, if you even use the word war to describe this war, you risk at the very least a fine. All right, so let's say, hopefully this gives you an idea of how much the Russian government cares about controlling the information. So what if you are in Russia and you want to get alternative sources of information about the war? Where would you go? Well, it's definitely not established media. They're all either state-controlled, loyal to the state, or abroad, or and so on. You would usually go to social media for news today and before. And not exclusively Western social media platforms, but to a large extent also social media platforms like Facebook, like YouTube especially, like Twitter, like Instagram. Well, guess what? Russia banned Facebook, Instagram, and slowed down Twitter, as Valentyna mentioned. YouTube has not been blocked yet. It's been threatened to be with blocks like every 2 months. I think it's a tradition that YouTube is threatened with a block. Still alive. So YouTube has evolved into this weird information bridge. On one hand, connecting the limited oppositional, regime-critical information space in Russia with the Western information space, with the Ukrainian information space. But the thing is, the Russian government knows this, and the Russian state-controlled media knows this too. What they've been doing is that they've been populating YouTube with Russian state-controlled outlets for years. So the Russian state-controlled outlets that spread the narratives that I told you about are also on YouTube. They have their own channels to reach Russians who don't watch TV or Russian-speaking people abroad, like Kazakhstan, like Ukraine, like Belarus. So here's the thing. YouTube has, just like many tech firms, have committed themselves to fighting disinformation, also in the context of this war, right? So what YouTube has done is that YouTube has made a global ban on Russian state media. So they've implemented the ban in the entire world on many Russian state-controlled news outlets. So YouTube has evolved into this weird battle space where actors from different sides try to control what side of the story do we get about the war. And I find this super fascinating. So this is why my co-authors and I, Christina Pedersen, Jonas Pedersen, and Anna Rogers, we've set out to try to examine what are the effects of YouTube's own global ban on Russian state media, right? And what is the change in commenting behavior on YouTube following Russia's censorship law in March? So two goals. And to answer these empirical questions, we get data, of course. We love data. So we have collected about 12 million YouTube comments for 40 Russian-speaking channels. So 10 Russian state-controlled media outlets that have been blocked by YouTube. By the way, they weren't forced to, not all of them at least. 10 blocked pro-Kremlin news channels that have, 10 pro-Kremlin channels that have not been blocked by YouTube, but are still spreading pro-Kremlin disinformation. This, for example, includes a Ukrainian vlogger, Shapovalova, who's wanted for treason in Ukraine. So just to give you an example of what we're talking about. And 10 regime-critical channels that try to challenge or criticize the Russian government. And for comparison, 10 entertainment channels that are mainly about Minecraft, Baby Shark, I know, as political as you can get, okay? The results. So let's talk about YouTube's global ban on pro-Kremlin media, essentially disinformation sources. So I'm going to walk a little bit around. So what you see here is that the x-axis, the horizontal line, shows you number of days before and after YouTube's global ban, okay? So the y-axis shows you the number of comments that these channels get in our sample. And commenting engagement is important because it also hypes up the visibility of the channels. This is why YouTubers always a million times ask you to leave a like, to leave a comment. So let's look at online engagement for entertainment channels. As you can see, there is no discontinuous change in commenting behavior here. So Baby Shark and Minecraft is fine. If you look at pro-Kremlin blocked media, you see a sharp discontinuous decline to almost zero. Within just few hours, YouTube has implemented this. And this is interesting because these bans don't always work. But what we show is that YouTube's ban on Russian state media did work. Kind of. So is it YouTube versus Russia 1.0, as France 24 wrote when covering this part of our finding? Well, yes, kind of. Because if you take a look at the next graph, it's the exactly same thing. So number of days before and after YouTube's ban, the y-axis shows you engagement through number of comments. Take a look at pro-Kremlin media that has not been blocked. So spreading the same disinformation as before. Instead of a decline, you see a sharp, discontinuous, and stable increase in commenting behavior. So essentially, what we think is going on that not all, but some of the users move from blocked pro-Kremlin channels to non-blocked pro-Kremlin channels that are essentially showing you the same thing. All right, let's pause the YouTube's ban and talk about the Russian censorship law. So look at on an engagement for regime-critical channels, right, that sort of try to challenge the Russian regime. So the gray vertical line is the day of the invasion in 2022. The red vertical line is the day Putin signed the so-called anti-disinformation law. So no activity around or before and after the censorship law. So we expected that because the punishment also for social media activity is so severe and it's so vague, it's unclear exactly what you punish for and when, we expected the comment engagement to go down. We thought that many of those like Russian-speaking people who leave a comment, they'd rather be safe than sorry, right? We find no evidence of this at all in our data. We see no decline in commenting behavior. Does this mean that that the Russian oppositional YouTube is resilient to censorship? We don't actually know. We're trying to find out. Is it because the comments are more pro-Kremlin? Is it because they are more regime-critical, more careful? We're trying to use machine learning techniques to analyze all of this content right now. All right, so recap. YouTube's own ban on pro-Kremlin media worked, but we also showcased the challenges of policing cyberspace, right? Engagement likely moved to other pro-Kremlin channels. We don't know what is the net result here. We see no decline in engagement for regime-critical channels following Russia's censorship law, but we're still digging deeper into this. So you get to see the research as it is being done, essentially. So what's the general takeaway here? Well, the first thing is that we need to view social media as an ecology. So if you buy the idea that YouTube can and should be fighting disinformation by blocking disinformation sources, that is what I believe, full disclosure, but some of my colleagues may disagree. But if you buy this premise, you have to make sure that your policies are large enough in scope from the beginning. You do not want to engage in a whack-a-mole game where you whack one mole, then users move to other channels. Because whenever you incentivize users to shift around social media platforms, there is an inherent risk that these other platforms they're moving to are even more radical or even more full of disinformation than before. We don't know whether this is the case here, but this is an inherent risk that is there. And lastly, I would just like to call for more transparency mechanisms through access to data. So the thing is, this is also a transparency exercise. YouTube said that they're going to do this thing. We show you that they have done what they say they would do, and we show you the potential unintended consequences of these policies. But the thing is, at the time of us downloading the data, YouTube did not have to give us this data. Okay? In theory, by the way, many tech firms don't give us this data. So in theory, they could say that they're going to do this policy and not implement it and get away with it. We would never find out the scale of their policy. So this is why, even whether you agree or disagree with these kind of attempts to police the cyberspace, it's super important that we politically discuss how we can maintain access to this kind of data so that we can have a more informed discussion about essentially what kind of internet we want to have, right? Because this is also a matter of democracy, if you ask me. Like, political communication takes place on YouTube also, to a large extent. And we need to know what is happening with this data to be able to, to decide to make the kind of future that we want to have. That was all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Yevgeniy, and come have a seat again. And really, again, extremely interesting to get the data to work for us this way. But what are you saying at the end here? Are you saying that global bans is really not the way to go? Is that your recommendation? Or what's your assessment?
Yeah, so usually I try to avoid giving normative claims about what you should do and not do and leave this to the audience, who is much wiser than me in this. But no, this is not an argument against using global bans. In fact, on the contrary, I think the reason why YouTube actually succeeded in cutting off the main Russian state-controlled channels is exactly because it was global. Because if it was local, they could just use VPN, proxy server, pretend to be from a country where the ban is not implemented, and just log back online. But what I'm saying is that if you do a global ban, you have to think holistically from beginning. You don't want to move around users because you don't know where they're going to end. Yeah.
Great point. What I will do now is really to open the floor and get the questions from you. You could hear 3 different perspectives. What do you have of questions to the panel? The floor is open.
I have a question for you, Yevgeniy. Did you see a specific correlation between the pro-criminal media, which was banned, and the pro-criminal media, which wasn't banned? Was it because they published different content, like specific content, and what content made the channel get banned and what content did not get banned?
Should I just answer right away? No, we did not. We did not try to infer. So essentially, if we were to do what you're asking, it would be an exercise of us trying to infer what YouTube is doing, right? The best strategy here would be to just call YouTube and ask them, which I don't think, honestly, is our job. Like, it's their job to document exactly what they're doing. Please correct me, to the best of my knowledge, we don't actually know how they sampled what to ban and what not to ban. And this is exactly why I also end this talk by please reminding you, whenever you see, is there someone from Google here? If you see someone from Google or YouTube, please remind them to push for more transparency about what is going on. I mean, we could try to see if we can guess, but the best answer to a question would be if they just told us. And to the best of my knowledge, they haven't. And this, I think, is a big example of the issues that we're facing right now. I hope this answers your question somewhat.
But can I just, on this, perhaps try to turn the discussion a little bit about the media tactics of democracies? Chris, you alluded to the key role of institutions in your presentation and perhaps the lack of expertise. Could you unfold that a little bit more? Perhaps also after hearing Jane's presentation here, you know, who is it that should be countering this? What is the media tactics of democratic institutions in this context? It's a great question.
It's a great question. I think part of the challenge is that the landscape has changed so profoundly that we haven't been able to figure that out. So the typical response in this environment is we need more independent journalism because the journalism sector has been hit so hard just about everywhere, and we need more independent journalism, which is true. We need more independent journalism, but it isn't necessarily the case that even if we had more independent journalism, we would solve the issues we're discussing here today. Mm-hmm. Because in essence, what's evolved over the last 15 to 20 years with the digital revolution plus these globalized, adapting global authoritarian powers like Russia and China is that they're using all of their resources in the information domain to advance state objectives. And it's not something that the democracies can easily respond to because we don't control things. We have a lot of players in the space, and I don't think we figured it out, to be honest. I think this is a big part of the challenge. Part of what's happened is you have civil society playing a huge role here, doing, frankly, great research like the kind that's being presented today from the academic sphere, the scholarly sphere, new initiatives popping up just about everywhere, dealing with these new information and technology-related issues. But it's a very heavy burden, I would say, for scholars and civil society to do battle with the Chinese Communist Party or Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, this is what they prioritize. When Vladimir Putin does his budget, he doesn't say, how do I make sure my schools and hospitals are funded? He says, how do I make sure my information and internal security services are well funded? And by the way, coming out of the 20th Party Congress in Beijing, public internal security went like this in China, and they don't, they're not miserly with their investments in the information front in the PRC either. That is a huge priority, and I actually think the democracies are struggling with that. We have the BBC and Deutsche Welle and AFP, but they're actually performing an independent journalism function, sharing the facts and doing journalism. It's not designed to address these new challenges, especially in the digital age where disinformation can be customized at scale. And that's part of what we're dealing with. A lot of attention, just one final thought on this relevant to Russia and China. So when Russia annexed Crimea and then started waging war in eastern Ukraine in 2014, everybody said, oh my gosh, you know, disinformation is the principal tool that's being used. We've got to really focus on that. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much. And nobody was paying attention to China. And then as China started demonstrating that it could do disinformation at scale, which it's doing now, I would say in a more profound way than Russia, everybody said, oh my gosh, we have to look at China, and they put Russia on the back burner, and then Russia attacked full-blown Ukraine. Everybody said, oh my gosh, look at Russia, and people stopped looking at China, and now Xi Jinping has a 20th Party Congress where they're emphasizing this. It's a huge challenge to deal with both of these authoritarian powers who are prioritizing information and digital manipulation globally. And I think all of the democracies need to really pay more attention and figure out how to design responses that are consistent with liberal democratic values, but are actually commensurate with the challenge. And we are nowhere near to doing that right now.
So next question, of course, what should we do? But then, and you still can reflect a little bit on that, what we do next, but I would like to bring you in, Yevgeniy, on this about detoxifying also the algorithms and your point that, well, if you do bans, especially if you do it locally, then people just move to other platforms. So is there a danger if we push too hard on the Western platforms that it gets even more difficult to do the detoxifying algorithm stuff or recommendation that Jane comes with? What's your reading of that?
I think these are two connected but very different issues, like detoxifying algorithms and us liberal democracies banning. So if I comment on detoxifying algorithms, what are algorithms? Essentially, we're talking about maybe 60,000 lines of code. It's never one algorithm. It's probably 100 or 1,000 algorithms, depending on which platform we look at. We cannot detoxify these algorithms if we don't know what they are.
Exactly.
And sometimes we don't want to know what algorithms are. Sometimes we need to know what do they do, right? Of course, YouTube will not give us their secret sauce. I mean, they'll go out of business. But again, and this may sound like I'm just asking for more research funds, and I do. But we need transparency mechanisms, funding more research, more journalism, to try to understand what do these algorithms actually do. When are these algorithms racist, for example? When are they promoting genocide? Because we're talking about so many thousands of lines of code, the people who write them don't know what they do. And I'm not kidding, like this is the reality that we're facing. So we need transparency mechanisms in terms of, are we pushing too hard in banning in the EU? For example, I think it's a very difficult question, and what I want is also us to have this debate to begin with, because it's a political question. You're sort of asking me, like, which party am I going to vote for? It's a matter of values, and what kind of values do you want? But I think one thing we should distinguish between is, first of all, we should stop being naive and pretend we're going to live in peace forever. There's a difference between war and peace. So during, for example, World War II, liberal democracies were banning Nazi propaganda. When Russia invaded, for example, Ukraine in 2014, we saw a very different line of things that Ukraine was doing and still is doing. So I think while debating this, we have to think, what are we actually going to do in peace now? And what are we going to do in case of war? For example, what if China actually launches an invasion of Taiwan in 15 years? Are we going to let TikTok, our kids, go around with TikTok and collect data about us and send them directly to the government? Maybe. Maybe that's the right thing to do, maybe not. But I hope you can see that the answer to a question is very different depending on which situation we're facing.
Sure.
Are we fighting for national survival, or are we just talking about policing hate speech in times of peace? I sort of miss this distinction, probably because I work with war, but yeah. Sorry for the long monologue.
Great. Just looking if there are any burning questions before giving Chris a chance to answer that other easy question.
So I'll go ahead and give it a shot. I think, I'm sorry? Is the mic? Yeah, it's on now? You can hear me? Okay. I think we can't suffer from a failure of imagination. Yevgeniy just said, what if we were at war? I think if we were talking 5 years ago, even after the annexation of Crimea, and someone would have said Russia would launch a full-scale war on Ukraine, it would have hit everyone's ears as very unusual. And yet, there's a full-scale war not that far from where we're sitting now, even if you don't feel it in the way Ukrainians feel it. The Baltic states feel it, and the Baltic states are not so far from here. And per capita, the Baltic states are investing in Ukraine's survival and its ability to prevail in ways that most other countries are not. And those are tiny countries, as people here know. I think not suffering from a failure of imagination means that we take the information and tech challenges really seriously. And I'm not sure we have to date. And so, to the extent the authoritarians are willing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars towards their preferences in this space, why shouldn't the democracies? For investigative journalism, to stabilize our media sectors, to recognize that there are security implications of having vulnerable information sectors. And this is the reality we're already in. Why don't we take it seriously? I mean, it's really a question for all of us, or more seriously. And you really need, at some level, like-minded countries working together, putting aside what we might agree are maybe tangential differences between European countries, between and among countries in the transatlantic space, and really kind of settling on the top order principles that we should agree on, given the new environment we're in. So that's just one observation at the top. More specifically, I think it's really hard for any given citizen in a democracy to navigate the policy terrain of these tech and digital information questions, or themselves to manage the 5 devices they have and all the information they're getting. I think we have to be realistic on that front, that media literacy, digital education at the individual citizen level may happen in Finland, where they educate their kids in elementary school on that front, which is great. God bless the Finns. More of us should be like them. But that doesn't happen in most countries. I think part of what we need to look at is how our elites and key gatekeepers are better equipped to do this. So I'm interested in Jana's observation about working with journalists and editors, because I think journalists and editors in democracies have been really ill-equipped to deal with the new environment, generally speaking. So for example, the former Lithuanian foreign minister used to stress this idea that a lie is not an alternative point of view. But what you often find for journalists in democracies is that, and I'll use an example from several years ago when Russia is widely understood to have shot a civilian airliner out of the sky, the M17, a number of years ago. And there were 10 different lies coming out of Russian state media to confuse audiences, and you had many journalists in democracies actually referring to the lies in their reporting. So if you have a lie over here and the truth over here, landing in the middle is not a good thing. And this is something that I think journalists and free societies, editors struggle with even today with the experience we've had. We should do much more with gatekeepers to help them understand the new environment. I think understanding the ways you get more reform and meaningful regulation at the societal level will also require civil society to be better translators of these issues, to explain the stakes so that algorithmic transparency and data transparency and ownership don't seem like some very complicated, distant challenge, but actually are brought down to earth so that people can understand it in common and accessible language. I don't think we've done such a great job on that front. And then finally, I think from a global level, the stakes are particularly high among the middle-performing countries in places like Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere, who are determining the direction they take as they start to situate their policies. My guess is a lot more can be done by all of us to help push things towards better outcomes when the choices are stark. Will it be a choice that leads towards control and manipulation, or will it be a choice that leads more towards accountability? And there too, there's a lot of good work being done now, but I would suggest that given the stakes involved, we can do much more on that front. But it starts, I would argue, with the countries that are strongest leading the way. So those are just a few ideas.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I think now we are sitting between lunch and the audience, and therefore we could actually continue for a long time with this discussion. But I just wanted to thank you all, Yevgeniy, Chris, and Jane, for really thought-provoking presentations here, and not least also the advice that you all gave, that I think can really bring in also to the next session that is all about activism. So trying to see that segue to the next panel after lunch. So again, thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be here. At the moment of questions, we will be
there. Okay. Hello, everyone. Please find a seat. I can see you got coffee. All is good. Great. I am really happy to be here and actually also hosting the last session, because we've had so many super interesting people talking with a lot of background and information, and I'm sure that some of the information you have received up until now and the questions you have, you can bring into this session. Because this session is about how can tech help digital activism. Just to set a little bit perspective, I come from IMS, which is the Organization International Media Support, and we work mainly with journalists. But if you, and the way we try to describe our work very shortly is that if you have good journalism, you also get better societies. Good journalism in itself, of course, doesn't do it, which is why that good journalism also is the opportunity for activists to come out with their word and with the questions that they have and the criticism they have towards the decision makers. And the question here is, of course, mainly towards authoritarianism, which is the theme of the conference. And we are so happy to have 3 panelists. One is Fenya, who is from the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'll come back to Fenya. And Sergey, a journalist. I'll also come back to Sergey. And Esben, who is representing tech. As you know, we just had elections in Denmark. Most of you would know. I think you would know. And due to that, Fenya will give a description of the Danish work, but not take questions, because if you know, we have quite a well-functioning system here, and that also means that when there's not a politician in place, the people working in the ministries are limited in the things that they're saying. So just so that you know that. But we're happy that you're here, Fenya. Before I give you the word and introduce you properly, I just want to explain to you a little thing that is going on besides of us being here. Because when we discuss the way authoritarian states are clamping down on civil society, they're also to a very highly extent clamping down on journalists. And today and tomorrow, all states and media development organizations like IMS are meeting in Austria to discuss safety of journalists. There's a plan that's described saying something about how journalism is protected. And that exactly is necessary in order for us to be able to lift up the activism. So I just want to give you that kind of seeing this in a perspective, that what we are talking about here is a part of it, but what we really need to do from our perspective, from our message, is also to ensure safety of journalists globally. I'm super proud to be able to introduce Sergey Parkhomenko. I'm looking at my Russian help here. Yes. And it's actually also personally, because if you work in an organization that works with journalists and you then read the CV of what you've been doing, you were mixing, or you're finding the balance between journalism and digital activism even before we knew that it was called digital activism, and there was a link between them. And you can come back to some of the examples of what you've been doing. And just for those of you, I guess you read some of the background in the program, but back in the 90s, Sergey was an independent journalist. I think you all know what independent journalism means now in Russia. Hence, you're not flying in from Russia, I can say. In the 20s, and you were a media leader, and you also hosted a political talk show up until earlier this year. So you can definitely give us some examples very concretely on what we've been talking about on an overall level all day. So please, Sergey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's a great honor for me. Thank you for having me. It's very easy to be one of the last speaker on the conference because everything is already explained. Everything is already done. But it's also difficult because of this. So I will change completely my presentation because my colleagues explained it everything about the situation in Russian media. I will just remember you that it's not 24 of February 2022. Putin started to terrorize Russian media. It was started 22 years ago. And for these 22 years, Putin's regime tried to create a very aggressive environment for Russian media. I think the idea of Putin's media politics, Putin's approach to media matters is it is not possible to kill all the cockroaches in your house, but you can try to make their life terrible and unsupportable. So make life of journalists terrible and insupportable. It was for these 22 years the idea of Putin's power. And we can try to find some periods on the development of this politics. The first one was, I would say, the economic one. It was the time of creation of very difficult economic situation where state took control about all economic possibility to develop media in Russia, and the largest media outlets was even nationalized or put under the control of some oligarchs loyal to the Kremlin, or all the natural mechanism of monetization of media was destroyed because the state-controlled advertising market and distribution market, and all forest investment was banned on the field of the media. It took more or less 10 years to create the situation where Russian journalistic industry, media industry, don't exist in Russia, and no normal economic activity on the Russian media. And then it was the period after 2012, I think, after the moment of big popular protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg on the winter 2011-2012. It comes another period, the period of foreign agent. And more legislation in Russia was adopted about this regime of foreign agent, and with the time it was started as the measure to control firstly NGOs and civic initiative, and then media, and then individually journalists. And now every single Friday evening we have to visit a website of Ministry of Justice in Russia to see newcomers in the list of foreign agent. And now we have, as of today, we have, I just see yesterday, individuals recognized as media foreign agents, 144. My number is 135. So everybody knows his personal number. Legal entity recognized as media outlet, foreign agents, 52. Whole teams, whole media outlets. Individuals recognized as foreign agent, 49. And it's just a story of make life difficult, terrible, and insupportable, because foreign agents have to mark every single Facebook post or tweet or something for a special disclaimer that it's a foreign agent, and we have to make lots of strange accountability, showing every single ruble or dollar coming to you bank account, and every single ruble to expenses, and to make lot of work, of idiotic work to this person or media outlet to be foreign agent. Then it was come this story of undesirable organization and some it was extremist society. Yeah. So for example, the Navalny team was an extremist society. Every contact with this organization, with this media outlet, with this team is a crime, and you can be punished by some years of prison. And we have some media declared as extremist society. For example, the Media Project or Important Stories, and so on. All this time, blockings. As of Roskom Svoboda, it's activist project who monitors and records all kind of repression against the media. Since 2012, almost 1,200 internet sites in Russia have been blocked entirely in Russia at request of prosecutor's office. More than 160,000 of web pages or publication was blocked. More than 6,000 internet pages have been blocked since the beginning of the military invasion in Ukraine. So the question is why it's still alive. The question is why Russian media still function, and so I think the name, the title of my presentation, Digital Resistance, is wrong. It's not a digital resistance, it's a human resistance. Because it's still alive because of people, because of personal work. And be journalist in Russia now it's to create something like a personal civic project in your life, and to use your life for this profession and for this effort. I remember one example about one of the media outlets still working in Russia, because you know that it was explained today, most of Russian newsrooms, most of Russian media projects flown from Russia and working abroad in Baltic countries or in Germany, in Armenia, Georgia, but some still working in Russia. And one of them is an internet magazine called Люди Baikala, Peoples of Baikal. It's a small team of journalists, 4 women and one boy, a photographer, writing about people on the Baikal region. So it's it's eastern Siberia. It became very, very important and interesting, especially on the time of war, because it's the zone of massive mobilization for the Russian troops in Ukraine. On the first stage of war, not so many people was mobilized in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and another biggest cities in Russia, but on this region, it's in national republics around Baikal and eastern Siberia, like Yakutia, Tuva, Chechynskaya Oblast, and Baikal, Irkutsk, this part of Russia. So they describe the situation there, and this story of thousands of people coming to Ukraine for war, and after coming back on the black plastic bags, because it's lots of casualties on this region. So the editor-in-chief of this internet magazine, her name is Olga Mutovina, told me, every single morning I choose, before to go on the office, I choose my jeans, my t-shirt and my bra, thinking about what would be more comfortable in case of search today and arrest today. So in what t-shirt I can do to be lying on the floor on the moment of search, and for pass my night on the prison. That's the work. That's the daily effort to do to think every single morning about the search and arrest they can coming today. And so, what we have to do on this situation? First, if we speak about thousands of Russian journalists working abroad now outside Russia, the problem is, naturally, the problem of status, the problem of visas, the problem of residence permits, the problem of working permits. We need absolutely a special status for Russian journalists and civil activists. The status of political refugee doesn't work in this case, because the political refugee normally don't work, normally don't travel, normally don't come back and forth on the zone of war and back. So we have something special. We have something designed especially for this case, and this is a decision of European authorities and some some countries who can try to create it. We have the examples of Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, sorry, and Germany, where there's some special decision are created now. If we speak about all kinds of blockings, these thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of blocked websites and media outlets, VPN is the very important decision. One of my colleagues speaks Ukraine needs javelins and Russia needs VPNs as a special ammunition for war. It's true, not all the VPNs working on Russia, but it become now something very important and something massive. The very interesting question of discussion today, why the YouTube is not blocked by Russian government. One of the answers is they don't want to learn VPN techniques to mass Russian audience. Because on the YouTube, you have lots of people who use YouTube's not for political news, not for political information. And firstly, for cartoons for children, for porno, for sports, for gastronomic recipes, and so on. If you block YouTube in Russia, you will learn millions of people to use VPNs because they will need the cartoons and porno. So it will be great school of unblocking. It will be a great school for millions of people how to see the information on the time of blocking. But we need the possibility for lots of this technical decision. Also, what is very, very important, it's the direct internet, like Skynet, the Starlink, yes, like Starlink and other project of Google and Microsoft. We need this, and we understand that Russian state will ban it, will fight against all kind of device they can work with these techniques of direct internet. But it's a solution, and very important solution for fight against the block of massive Russian press. What is also very important is the techniques of special application designed for concrete media outlets. We have some example like Medusa or Ważne Historii or Project or Mediazona. They have a special application working on the iPhones or on the Android system. It's a very good idea to use this because it's very difficult to block if you have not a website but an application can buy on the Apple or Google market. So some technical decision plus some personal projects. That's the explanation of life of Russian media today. Thank you.
You can take place here.
Yeah. Okay.
I actually think that was a very good way to lead into the next speaker. But before I get to Esben, I would want any of you, if you have just a more or less of a clarification of question, Sergey, please just
okay.
so we can see you, which we want to. If you have any clarification questions,
we'll have one more.
Yeah, but so now you will sit here and
okay.
listen to Esben, and I will join you, and then people can ask us questions afterwards. So. So any clarification or questions for Sergey before we move on to Esben, who's actually representing what you were just explaining here, how some of the media, and we will also get a little discussion on the activists, they need technical solutions to actually work and leverage the human rights. I can just explain a little, mention that our colleagues in Myanmar are explaining that people are getting their phones taken by the police and the authorities and checking if they have a VPN. And if you have a VPN, that in itself in Myanmar is enough for you to get arrested. And I remember the colleagues from Medusa explaining to us at IMS that in Russia, when they were closed down, suddenly they got a lot of users in Netherlands and in New Zealand. And you wonder why? Well, those are the countries that you often choose when you have a VPN. So, But any clarification or questions for Sergey before we introduce Esben? Please.
I guess I'm just interested in when did you leave Russia, and like when did it become so hard or unbearable for you to work as a journalist in Russia, and why?
One more time.
When did you leave Russia? When did it become unbearable for you to be in Russia?
I was my last time in Russia in April 21. Just so one year before war. Because I understand that also I have to decide every morning about a t-shirt and jeans to be more comfortable on the moment of search. Because everybody around me was searched or arrested or with some personal pressure. So I fled from Russia in April, and it was very difficult for me. But it was the decision where I can't understand that I can work from abroad because of firstly YouTube, and I started my YouTube channel, and I started to speak from abroad. And I continued to work on Echo Moskvy remotely. And Echo Moskvy was closed just 1 week after the beginning of war on March 22. And it's also an interesting moment, but Echo Moskvy was the most important independent radio station in Russia for 25 years. And on the moment of when Echo Moskvy was closed, dozens of journalists and dozens of experts of Echo Moskvy continue to work individually as if never happened. Individually on the YouTube, firstly. Every single journalist of Echo Moskvy has your personal YouTube channel. And after maybe 3 or 4 months later, this group of channel was reunited as some construction, some structure to be together and to work together and coordinate our effort. It was a very interesting experience to be destroyed, to be dispersed, and to be reunited after, thanks to YouTube.
Thank you, Sergey. I think we can keep listening to explanations like this for a long time. I would ask you to keep the questions so we can also have Esben's perspective, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, okay.
So I want to come back to a question that's stated in the program here. It says, can we envision a future where democracies help digital platforms protect human rights online and maintain a free and open internet? You could also turn the question about how perhaps it's not democracies that need to help digital platforms. Perhaps it's the digital platforms that need to help democracies. So that's what will be my lead into you, Esben. Esben has started an organization and has been supporting startup and tech. And you have also created, I think it's called Tech Barbecue, which is the biggest tech, what do you call it, conference?
Tech
startup conference.
Yeah.
So he has a lot of knowledge about tech startups. Please, Esben.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Sergey, for sharing. Thank you. I think it's moving when it's not just something it's not a game we play, but you come and you are a real human being, and you, like, it's different for me to read all the newspapers and hear what's going on, and then to meet you. So it's an honor to hear your story and the work that you do. So in my childhood, I'm born in '83, so in my childhood in the 90s, I was watching Beverly Hills. The wall had just come down, and the world just got better and better and better. So when I was 20 actually, when I started a company, we had no ambition about becoming, fixing any problems in the world, because there were no problems. It was just getting better all the time. So I say that because when I talk to startups today, there is actually quite a lot of the people that are starting companies in Denmark that are starting them with a vision of fixing one of the many problems we have today. Yeah. So that is one of the few things that actually give me hope in this difficult time. Yeah. So after starting my company, WideAway.com, back in the days, I got some money, and then I started to meet with other people that started a company that were asking for money for an investment into this company. So I've met a lot of young tech entrepreneurs that say, hey, we want to build this really, really big company with this new technology. And it's actually a nice way of learning about all the new technologies, because they will tell you everything to convince you how cool they are and that they know everything about this technology. So I've learned a lot, and I've seen a lot of things. And sometimes I've been in crowds like this, where you can just imagine that we were all investors, and then came all these Løvens Hule or Dragon's Den people on stage and talked about these technologies. And then sometimes I would sit in the crowd and I would say, wow, that technology, that can be a fantastic big business in 5 to 10 years, because it's going to change everything. And then afterwards, when we had the dinner in the evening, then sometimes I would talk to some of the other people in the room, and we would say, shit, how will the society deal with these challenges? So I remember one dinner I had at a point where we had this discussion going, and I asked these, it was a guy from London, one from Silicon Valley, and one from Estonia, and then myself, and we had this dinner, and I think it was so important to talk about how should we help society deal with all these changes that we are going through. And then this guy from Silicon Valley, he told me that Esben, forget all about it. The society will never be able to deal with these changes. What you should do is that you are one of the lucky few, so you should buy some land either in New Zealand or Uruguay. Then you should cross your fingers that Elon Musk will make this technology ready, where you can take a starship and then you can go to the moon or Mars or wherever, and live there and with your family. And then when everything has gone crazy on Earth, someday it will come down and it will be relaxed again. Then you can come back with your family. Yeah. So I was not so happy with that answer, but yeah. But this is not a stupid man, and he's not a freak, but maybe not Danish in his way of thinking that, hey, we need to take responsibility for where we are going. Yeah. So most of the companies and the startups that I work with, they are thinking about one thing, and that's their own business, because you need to work very hard to build, from an idea to build a big business. But there are some of these, especially some of those that have made proper good businesses, that now they've had their money, now they're thinking, where are we going as a society? And some of these, especially some of these, are very worried for where we are going as a society. So some of them is talking about China, the whole surveillance, social media, how it's polarizing our society, the speed of change, because we have so many new technologies coming at the same time, automation and other things. So if we zoom out and look at it in a historic perspective, then I would say that every time there comes a new media technology, then there is always changes, and it's shaking society. So if we go back 500 years, we had the printing press. The printing press was like, it created a lot of wars and a lot of trouble all over Europe. But what it also did was it gave us a reformation, it gave us enlightenment, and it also gave us democracy. So it's not a simple answer to see what happens when we have these new technologies. If we go back, let's say, to 80, 90 years ago, Hitler came. A lot of the reason why he came to power was because of this new technology with the radio. And I remember reading a story or a book by Per Stig Møller, a former minister of Denmark. He wrote it in the 90s, and he was quoting some French people saying, some French experts saying that probably TV could be the end of democracy, because this new technology is super difficult to handle. So that said, I really don't want to underestimate the challenges we face with social media, how it's polarizing our society. I think it's very, very dangerous, and we should be very much aware, and we need to handle this in time. So that's the negative part of what we see, and also what we see in US, where it's super polarized as a society. But there is also a positive story of it with social media, which is that before I had 17 newspapers in Denmark, and I could read all of those, and they would tell me what is the truth. But in a social media world, if all of you could have a voice, that's a fantastic democracy, because it's not just one media or 7 medias that decide what is the truth, but all of us can decide the truth. But of course, if we don't know if it's a Russian troll that tells me things that I think is the truth, or so it's super unstable, because we didn't manage to get hold of what this thing is doing to our society, because it's shaking so many things. Yeah. Yes. And I think we have a super scary time right now, and reality. So social media is one technology, but there is a lot of technologies right now in China being used to really build George Orwell's dream of a surveillance society. Like 500-600 million surveillance cameras, they can recognize you everywhere, because the computers can recognize how your look is, and even if you are one of these Muslims from this region, then it will see some speciality in your face, so they know, oh, suddenly there's one of you guys in Beijing, okay, we need to go and find out what you're doing here, or but also like checking all your text messages on the phone, seeing all your financial transactions, basically being able to listen in. When we can talk to Siri and she understands what we say, then if you talk on the phone in China, I'm sure they would be able to listen to what people are saying to each other. And back in the Soviet days, you needed a ton of people to sit and listen to what everybody is doing. But now you have computers that are so powerful that you can really basically have a computer. If it's not there yet in China, it's going to be there quite soon, where the computer can say, okay, who's saying she in the phone talk? Okay, I can hear when they say it, what sentiment are they in? Is it negative, neutral, or positive? And then you can basically know that everywhere. So it's super scary. I'll take a little water. So one thing that I take for granted is what I call the Paris narrative. So we have this idea that if the population is against the leader of their country, if the whole population is against it, they will be able to change the power. Like what we see in Iran right now, okay, if everybody goes out and protest and fight it, then they will be able to change the power. Because we've learned that back in Paris, and And that's kind of a narrative that we take for granted. I think that narrative is soon going to be nonsense. It's not going to be possible anymore. Because if you imagine, let's say, a Chinese society where you can surveil everything, and a computer can control or survey who's saying what, and you will never be able to gather a lot of people for something before it's found out so early. So I think what we see in Iran right now and Myanmar and some of these places, I think it's a question of time before we need to understand that that's probably not going to be possible anymore. So I think the VPNs and all the technologies, how can technology help these societies? I think I call it like the good hackers. Because we need the good hackers to be able to support. Maybe there are other ways to call it, but we need somehow to do our utmost best to make sure there is a possibility in Russia to get online, even though the society doesn't want you to get online. And this is one area where I think it's embarrassing what we see with Ukraine, that it comes so sudden that this minister writes to Elon Musk on Twitter, say, hey, you have some satellites, can you help us? Why should it be an entrepreneur that happens to say, yes, I want to support you, so I will send my satellites? Like, where is the leadership of this world? Somebody should have thought of that, because it's not rocket science. Of course, it's rocket science to build these satellites, but that we are not in Europe or in the US having these things on in the drawers, knowing that, okay, now this happens, so of course this is the plan, and we have it here. So there, I think that our diplomacy, our governments really need to be updated to not fixing 2020 problems with solutions from the 90s. And I think some of the initiatives that you talk about, Fenya, and also the nice event I attended in the UN city, Tech for Democracy, was really good. So I think some of the visions is there, but I still see some of the things that is happening, which is, it's not greenwashing, but it's tech washing, diplomacy, something which is not really saying, okay, now we have a plan, we know how to do it. And I'm not saying it's easy. But you can say it's not easy to get where we are. 200 years ago, some people were having a dream about a future where people actually could vote and all these fantastic things that we actually... So we are the result of a dream 200 years ago. And it was not easy to get here, but it's fantastic to be here. And actually, like, we just had elections and nobody got out and said, shit, it's stolen from me, this victory. So things are really working here. But so maybe one of the last things I will say is that I think we take democracy for granted in Denmark and in parts of Europe, and I think we should stop doing that. I think we have to be serious and say we need to do all we can to strengthen democracy at home, and we need to do all we can to help the rest of the world how they can use technology, or how to use and make plans, how can we use technology to strengthen their democracies. So VPNs is one part. There's a lot of things, and I'm not the tech geek that knows everything, but when I talk to the different founders, some of them, they really know how to do AI or VPNs or this. So I've gathered some of these people sometimes, and wow, it's amazing to dream with these. What better world can we build in 20 or 30 years? So maybe the last thing I will say is that I think my personal belief is that by 2050, either we have no more democracies in the world, or we've made them much better. Okay. Thank you.
That was a pretty tough one to end on. Please, Sergey. And please,
thank you.
You can be seated. Oh, I will be in a minute. So, I think I'll just ask a question that came to my mind while listening to you. So, if you discuss with tech and you have the view of the world that you have, we all thought that when social media came up, that it was going to only support democracy. Wow. Now you're discussing with those that are creating the future. what is most important in your discussion with them? Is it income that they make, or is it the way that they can support democracy? And how do you do that discussion?
It's a difficult discussion. If we take Google, they actually started out by saying, "Don't be evil." So I think they had a mission. They could be in this room and be filled with a vision where we should build the future, but then, some years ago they removed those lines from their statement because, you can't say that anymore if you're Google. So, so I think it's important to, some of the people that dreamed 200 years about the society we have today, they had a pretty good understanding of, we need to divide power and the fragility of the human being and how much power should you have. And so I think it's pretty obvious to me that founders are not angels, and they will never be. And if you put capital into a human being machine and the capital, they get power, those that have that capital. And so I think that whole, we of course need the politicians to do some regulations and help steer how we should do things. That said, I think it's very, very important that we, in policy making, include the tech people, and not just calling big American companies in to send some people to Copenhagen, but also include what's happening in Denmark and in Europe.
Thank you. Good. So this kind of multi-stakeholder way of looking at it is also because I can give a little more insight to what Fenya was mentioning about the Ukrainian roundtable, where we have organizations that are vetted, so we know that they're actually either real independent media around the table, together with tech, big tech, and Tech for Democracy, and then they have the opportunity to actually raise their hand and say, "Hey, you blocked this and this media. Why did you do that? We need to open it up." And that is only possible because we are gathering those that are thinking about tech, the people that are governing and can actually make rules, and then the actual people on the ground. And I think that from our side is one of the opportunities and solutions where we are doing what we are today, that we're gathering people from different parts. But I already see some questions, so there's one down there.
Yes, thank you very much for very inspiring presentations, both of you. My question is to Esben, and it's more of a clarification question, because I have to admit it was a bit difficult for me to follow the logic in your presentation. Now, I have been working with tech and human rights for many years, and it's always ends up at some point in the discussion of state authorities saying you should do better to tech, and tech saying, but you should regulate because we are not regulators, you are regulators, so tell us what to do. And when you were talking about the scary techniques that Chinese are using and so on, I was thinking, well, somebody have built those techniques, somebody have given them those technologies. It's not the Chinese government themselves that are building all those rocket science things. So, and at the same time, you were saying that all the tech people are thinking about is profit. In the end of the day, that's what they care about. So I'm a bit confused because, it seems that the tech community has a lot of dreams and they go 180 kilometers an hour and even faster with all those dreams. And then the politicians, they have their bureaucracies. They're not following. They're not catching up at all. And we as civil society are trying to catch both of them. We're kind of in the middle running around, and everybody's just saying, no, you should do better, no, you should do better, no, you should do better. Now, maybe we need to stop and think about our own responsibilities. So the state authorities, they're responsible for something, and then tech companies, they also have a responsibility, because if they were not building those technologies, maybe Chinese won't be using them. So what are sort of the accountability lines really, and take responsibility for that, rather than saying who should do what, if you understand what I mean. Or maybe I misunderstood your point, which
so
also could be the case.
Basically, one of my points, one of my points is the following: that why should we try to build a lot of business? So I'm representing startups in Denmark, but we want to try to be a responsible association. So I would say that what should we use big companies for? Why should we have a strong economy in the future if we have no democracy? Of course, the center always should be the well-being of human beings. And then that's number one. And then to support that, we need a strong economy. So a strong democracy stands on a strong democracy. So of course, we need to build big businesses in the future. We need to build much more tech companies in Europe. All the big companies built in the last 20 years have only been built in China and the US. So we need to focus on building big businesses. But for me, and what motivates me, is that that's because I want to live in a better future in 20 years. Because a strong democracy stands on a strong economy. And that's not where Europe is heading. Europe is to some extent heading to becoming a museum. And that's the best recipe for giving the keys to the biggest economy soon, which is China, which is terrible how they use technology. So I'm not a tech optimist. I'm super scared. I'm super enthusiastic at the same time. Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps that's a good place to be.
Yeah, maybe.
Or the only place. Yeah. So, Sergey, I want to bring you in. If you could ask something, now we have someone here who actually can influence tech startups. Do you have something on your wish list that we can ask Esben and tech?
A new possibility to create special applications and to break the very difficult rules of Apple and Google to adopt applications on the marketplaces, because maybe the most important and most sure, most powerful possibility to defend the media outlet on this situation is to create a special application for the phone, but it's very difficult to adopt it to rules of Apple and Google. Because they consider it as a commercial project, product. It's not commercial at all. The idea is to be unbeatable, to be unkillable on the environment of iPhone or your phone. So I think the creation of some Lego, some easy to use some universal instruments to create media applications possible on the rule of Apple and Google. That will be very, very important thing. Yes, because we have to understand that Russian media inside and outside Russia, both, live now on the situation of, if you know the movie Black Mirror, it's just like this. Because we are always on the pressure of some intrusion on your personal life, on your mail, on your messengers, on your phone. That's the most vulnerable thing is your phone. One example, I'm coordinator of Redkollegia project. Redkollegia is an independent journalistic prize, very important for Russia. And also Redkollegia organizes some events for journalistic community, some conferences and workshops and seminars. And one time on this conference, the editor-in-chief of iStories, Important Stories, told us they have a special trainer to teach digital security for journalists. And the reaction was very, very unusual. We need a school of digital security. It was 200 journalists on the room. So we create a special project like an individual school of digital security for journalists. And 120 journalists participate on this school. It was very interesting. It was individual work for trainer and journalist on Zoom. So you are one by one with this trainer. A trainer tell you, you have iPhone? Yes, show me. Show me your screen. You see this application, destroy it now. Show me the settings. Is it on or off? On. it will be off. So use it, don't use it, take this application, destroy this application. It was hours and hours of this teaching how to defend your communications, your private life for this special time, for this special environment, very aggressive environment where Russian journalists live every day. So we need something like this. We need a special security, secure instrument for our communication. Signal is good, but we know now that it's also break from time to time, and we need something new for this.
I'm sure you posed a question before. Let's take some questions from you, please.
Thank you, everyone, for the great presentations. I have a question for Sergey Borisovich. If you could elaborate a bit more, maybe. I assume that you, of course, follow up with the Russian media, how it develops and what narratives there are. But if you, since you also live here in Denmark now, I assume, or do you follow also the Danish media and any Western media? And if you do so, can you then identify maybe, did you face ever a case where you could actually identify a Russian narrative being presented in Danish media or in any Western media, or is it the case that we always successfully identify Russian disinformation? Or could you see these kind of narratives also in Danish news coverage, for instance?
Oh, for Danish news and Danish press, no. I'm not a specialist. I don't see often the Danish journalism. For European journalism, we see now the lots of problem to understanding Russian situation, and it was absolutely good thing explained today that the truth is not between two lies, and we saw lots of technological possibility used by Russian propaganda abroad. Example, it's all kind of commentary on the websites of big media outlets in Europe, because it's always present. This user-generated content. You go on the website of, I don't know, Le Monde or Spiegel or any big media in Europe. You see above the piece, above the article, the commentaries, and you see just the first moment, you can see the special commentary coming from Russian propaganda, and after it's just a first step, and after you see Germans claim to something, French are not. French are against something. British declare something. What is this British declare something? It's 2 or 3 Kremlin commentaries coming on the website of the time, and to make this commentary, and after it is took it by Russian propaganda to present as the point of view of British or Germans or French or Danish people. Danish people is not don't support Ukraine. Why Danish people don't support Ukraine? Because of these 2 or 3 commentary on Danish newspaper. So it's absolutely standard technology used every day and working in Russia. it's you can see it on Russian television every day. This story of Danish don't support or French are against this or something like this. So you can understand that European press and Western press is now also an instrument of Russian propaganda. And Russian propaganda try to enter to infiltrate inside the Western press.
Thank you, Sergey. No, I can perhaps say that Valentyna, who was here before, I know she actually goes to Danish media and discusses with them about the Russian narrative. So there's a focus on it. So thank you. I think there was one more question over there, and that might be the last one, unless any of you shouts, because we are closing up.
Well, okay, so I'll close on a small note. The financial markets, and this is for you, Esben, because I presume that you're quite a lot in contact with investors. We see today with the climate crisis that we have a lot of focus on investment on fossil fuels and don't go there, and people are being a bit shamed, to go in that direction, and investments that are countering human rights, etc. So a lot of things have happened in relation to investments, finance, and ethics. But if you go to the bank as a citizen here in Denmark and you want to throw, 10,000 euros into, let the bank invest for you, and you ask them, what will you invest my money in? The top 10 are these not very ethical tech companies sitting in Silicon Valley. So I would like to get a little bit behind, so we have a lot of people probably in this room who have investments through their banks here in Denmark who have invested into apps that are not even making money. WhatsApp, it's not making profit. They're just using it to harvest data to go into Facebook. I would like to hear a little bit about what are you talking with and about among your investor circles, and are there any prospects of more ethical investment into tech companies?
That was an easy question to end on.
There is a stronger and stronger tendency, or it's spreading this idea that to do impact investing, or some investors are saying, okay, we only do climate, but I would say it's still the majority. They are way ahead in Sweden. They've been talking about it for a long time. The same with gender and all of these things. We are like 10 years behind Swedes, and they are 10 years behind us when it comes to what you can say about immigrants. So we tend to mix there. So it's changing, but I see some startups that are building solutions where you can say, hey, invest in us, we invest in companies that we know they are ethical. The whole, some fintech companies that say, hey, you cannot go to your bank and say you want to invest in something green, then it's only big companies, and how green are they? And so I think in the coming years we will see some of these new things, implementations from EU side, that you need to have data. Are you green or are you not green? So that whole transition will also make it easier to invest in it. But it's very clear that to build a tech company like WhatsApp, it's much easier, and it's much less cash needed than if you need to build a climate factory that can fix some energy in a new way. Like the money you need are so much bigger to get started before you know if it works. Where in tech you can invest 1 million kroner, like 200,000 euro maybe, or less, in a company from some ITU kids, and then they try and it works, and then suddenly they get much more money, and then you have a really, really big company. So I think the whole investor world needs to adapt and change, but why would you? So that's the challenge, because if you can invest just a little money and suddenly it works and then it's really big, where now you need to invest a lot of money and you don't know if it works. So there is also like a different return on that. So there is some role that the government needs to play somehow to make sure that we make these things happen. And talking about that, and also the theme of today, the Danish government and many countries in Europe, they are leaning a lot into the climate that we put a lot of billions into we need to fix climate. I think one thing we should do in Denmark was to say that we also want to fix democracy and human rights, and so that could be one thing, to say that, okay, how could we actually make that into a business focus? Just like we make climate, it's basically thinking the values that we have represented in this room, how could we turn that into something that we could be rich of in the future? Because we managed to build these solutions.
I think that's actually a pretty good place to end this session. So thank you so much, also Fenya and those participating here for good questions. And then I'll leave the word to you, Charlotte. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
Super
you.
inspiring.
Thank you.
Stay here all night.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all your great questions, and thank you to all the panelists. I have the very difficult task here now to wrap up on the conclusions, and I won't take you through all the things, but I think actually what we ended up here on this note is actually very much what we need to do, is actually to acknowledge the threat, you could say, for our democracy, and actually start to invest in it. And I think Chris Walker said it when he said that, you know, the funds that are being used by authoritarian regimes, by Russia, by China, in terms of disinformation, we have to match that somehow, even though we do it in a different way. We have to and the fact that when you have the example of the tech for democracy, where you have this trusted community of civil society, government, and tech companies working to create an information environment that will last and keep the society running. We should not only do it in Ukraine, we should also do it for Russia, and we should do it for these areas. So we should acknowledge the threat and acknowledge the need for investments in that. So I'm sort of taking some of the discussions onto maybe a meta level, but I guess this is some of the recommendations that I see coming out of this, is that we cannot just leave it for the market economy to make things run and hope that it will all end, but we actually need, if we want to preserve our democracy, and if we want to even expand democracies, which has been going the wrong way for a long time, then we should actually do it. And as we actually in the house of Grundtvig, who was maybe I would say sort of the father of civil society in Denmark, and of information and education for people, I think that's some of the things that we have to acknowledge, the learning that came from there, and how we can take that forward. So with these words, and I would like to thank you all. It's been a fascinating discussion. We have recorded everything, and we'll make a bit of small bits and pieces afterwards. For those who don't want to be shown, you know, write to us if you don't want to be on. But anyway, thank you to IMS for the cooperation. Thank you to Freedom House for the cooperation. It's been fantastic. So have a nice day.